The wind came down off the mountains before the sun. 4 riders appeared on the ridge road at midday, moving slow under the hard white light. One led a 5th horse, empty saddle. In the yard, a man stopped working the barn hinge. The woman in the doorway saw his face change before she saw the riders. The bolt slid shut from inside. Rifles rested easy across the saddles. A 4th shape waited silent in the tree line. They did not call out. They did not ask the way. They simply came on. Dust rose under the hooves. The hinge hammer hit the dirt. A boot scraped the porch boards, and the door began to give. The wind came down off the Dragoon Mountains before the sun did. Every morning. Same time. Same sound. Land itself was clearing its throat before it spoke. Ezra Doyle stood in the doorway of the little clapboard house and let it hit his face. Cold, dry, smelling of sage and horse and something underneath that he never had a word for. Home, maybe. That was the word. He just never trusted himself to say it out loud. Because saying a thing out loud was how you lost it. He'd learned that a long time ago. Somewhere east of here. Somewhere he didn't let himself think about before coffee. You're going to stand there till the eggs get cold, Della said from behind him. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. He knew the sound of her voice the way he knew the sound of his own boots on the porch boards. Knew it better, honestly. Eggs don't get cold in October wind, he said. They get cold in July, when a man's got no excuse. Is that a fact? It's a fact. Well, a pause. He could hear her smiling without seeing it. That was a talent she had. Come inside and be wrong about it where it's warm. He went inside and was wrong about it where it was warm. That was the shape of their mornings. Small arguments about nothing, because nothing was the only thing left to argue about, after everything else had already been decided. She'd decided him. He'd decided her. 3 years back, in a town he barely remembered the name of now, and every day since had just been the two of them proving the decision out. Della Doyle was not a soft woman. People who met her expecting soft left disappointed, and she liked it that way. She could break a Mustang, mend a fence, and deliver a full breech, all before noon, and she'd tell you about the last one over breakfast, without losing her appetite. She had a laugh that came from someplace low in her chest and a temper that came from the same place, and Ezra had learned early which one he was dealing with by the set of her shoulders. He remembered the first time he'd heard that laugh. A dusty saloon porch in a town called Wilcox. 3 years back, Ezra half dead on his feet from 6 days in the saddle and not fit company for man nor beast. She'd been arguing with a mule about a saddle girth, losing the argument loudly, creatively, in language no proper lady was supposed to know. He'd laughed before he could stop himself. She turned around with fire in her eyes, ready to take the laugh out of whichever fool had made it. And then she'd seen his face. And something in her had gone quiet and considering instead the way a person goes quiet when they recognize something in a stranger they weren't looking for. "You look like a man who's forgotten what a bed feels like," she'd said. "I look like a man who's forgotten what a lot of things feel like." Well, she'd gone back to the girth strap, hiding a smile he caught anyway. "This mule's not going anywhere fast." "Neither, apparently, are you. Might as well sit." He'd sat. 3 years later, he still hadn't found a good enough reason to get back up. She kept a small tin of buttons on the windowsill, her mother's, and her mother's before that, brought west in a wagon that didn't have room for much else that wasn't useful. She wrote her sister in Ohio once a month, long letters full of complaints about the wind and the dust that never once mentioned how happy she was, because some things, she said, you didn't put on paper where anyone could read them plain. She kept a half-blind old hound named Scout, who slept across the threshold every night, like he still had teeth enough to matter, and every morning she snuck him a piece of bacon. She pretended Ezra didn't see her sneak. He saw, he never said anything. Some kindnesses worked better witnessed in silence. This morning her shoulders were easy. This morning was a good morning. She hummed something tuneless over the skillet, and Scout thumped his tail against the floorboards, without opening his eyes. And the coffee was too strong the way Ezra liked it, and she pretended to complain about, and outside the wind kept moving down off the mountains, same as it always did, carrying nothing in it yet that either of them could smell coming. He didn't know yet it was one of the last ones. He'd been a tracker. Once. Not a farmer who tracked on the side. Not a rancher with a gift for reading sign. A tracker, the kind the army sent for when the scouts came back shaking their heads. The kind other men said things about in low voices, like his name was a tool you didn't want lying around loaded. Ezra Doyle could find a man in country that swallowed men whole, could read a broken twig like other men read a newspaper, could tell you how many riders, How fast? How scared? How long ago? Off a patch of ground, most folks would walk straight across without a second look. He was good at it. That was the plain truth of it. And pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. He was also 30 years old the last time he did it, and he swore, kneeling in a wash with blood on his hands that wasn't his, that he was never doing it again. Not because he lost his nerve. Because he found out exactly what he was capable of, and it scared him worse than anything the country ever had. He could still see it, when he let himself. Which was rarely. Which was never, if he could help it, and he'd gotten good at not helping it happen. A canyon camp at first light. Cook fires still smoking from the night before. A detail of 11 men under orders that used the word hostiles. The way other orders used the word cattle, like the thing being discussed, wasn't quite a person. Not all the way. Not enough to slow a column down. Ezra had found the camp 2 days ahead of the detail. Read the ground like a book he'd been trained to read since he was 19 years old. Smoke drift, water use. The particular wear pattern of moccasins on rock versus boots. He'd done his job. That was the plain, ugly truth sitting under everything that came after. He had simply, competently, done his job. He hadn't fired a shot that morning. He wanted that remembered when he let himself remember any of it at all, because it was the one thin plank he still stood on some nights. He hadn't fired a shot. He'd only found the camp. Only told 11 men where to point their orders. Which was its own kind of trigger, if you looked at it honestly enough. And some nights he made himself look at it honestly, as a penance nobody had asked him to pay, and nobody but himself would ever collect. What he remembered most wasn't the noise, it was how fast it was over. 4 minutes, maybe 5, and afterward the canyon was so quiet. You could hear the cook fires still ticking as they cooled. A man does not forget a silence like that. It gets into the marbling of him, the way smoke gets into wool, and no amount of washing ever quite lifts it back out. He remembered kneeling in the wash afterward. Hands red that weren't supposed to be red, because he hadn't fired a shot, because the blood on his own 2 hands belonged to a boy no older than 17 he'd tried, too late, to pull clear of a ricochet meant for somebody else. He remembered thinking, with a clarity that had never once left him since, I did this. Not the men who fired, Minnie. I found the door and I opened it and I told 11 men where to walk through. He'd resigned inside the month. Told his commanding officer, a stiff, silver-haired man named Abel Whitfield, who'd built half his career on Ezra's eyes, that he was done. Whitfield had argued, then threatened. Then, when neither worked, had simply looked at him a long moment and said, quiet, almost kind, some men aren't built to carry what this work costs. No shame in knowing which kind you are before it breaks you all the way. Ezra had ridden out that same week and never looked back east again. Della knew there'd been a war, knew there'd been years he wore a uniform and carried orders instead of a plow. She'd never once asked him to fill in the shape with names and dates and faces, and he'd never once offered, because some doors once opened don't close back up neat. They just stay open, letting the cold in for good. He didn't talk about it. Della knew the shape of it, knew there'd been a war, knew there'd been years he wore a uniform and carried orders instead of a plow, but she'd never once asked him to fill in the shape with names and dates and faces. She had a gift for that too, knowing which doors not to open. You get that look sometimes, she told him once, early on, before they were married, when they were still 2 people deciding whether to become one. Like you're somewhere else, somewhere with a fence around it. What kind of look? The kind that says, don't follow me in there. He'd waited a long moment before he answered. I won't ever bring it here, he said. Whatever's behind that fence, it stays where I left it. She'd looked at him for a while, long enough that he started to sweat under it. All right, she said finally, but if it ever climbs the fence, it won't. If it does. She wasn't asking anymore, you tell me. You don't carry it alone in my house. He'd said yes, meant it too. A man can mean a thing with his whole chest and still be wrong about whether he can keep it. There was an evening, maybe 2 months back, that he thought of sometimes without meaning to. They'd sat out on the porch after supper, the way they did, most nights when the weather allowed it, Della with a mending basket in her lap. She wasn't really working. Ezra with his boots off and his feet stretched toward the last of the day's warmth, still coming up off the boards. Scout snoring between them, the mountains going purple, then gray, then gone. You ever think about it, she'd said, not looking at him. Working a needle through a shirt collar that didn't need it, leaving, going somewhere with a real town, a church with a bell in it. Neighbors close enough you could borrow sugar without it being a day's ride. You asking because you want to or because you think I want to. I'm asking because I'm nosy, and it's quiet out here, and I like hearing you talk." She'd glanced up then, and there was something soft in it. Something she didn't let show often, saving it up the way some people save good china. But go on and answer it honest anyhow. He'd thought about it. Really thought. The way he thought about ground sign, turning it over slow before he said anything he couldn't take back. "No," he'd said finally. "I spent 30 years in places that had church bells and neighbors, and I was lonelier in every one of them than I've been a single night out here with you and that useless dog." He's not useless. He caught a rabbit last spring. He caught a rabbit that was already dying of old age, Della, and he took 40 minutes doing it. She'd laughed, that low-chest laugh, and set the mending down, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, just sat there with the dark coming on and the wind easing off for once, and her hand finding his on the porch boards between them without either of them making a production of it. "I used to think," she said, quieter now, "that I'd end up alone out here. Not sad about it exactly, just resigned. Women like me don't always get chosen twice, and I'd already been through one man who didn't to see if the choosing took." She looked at him. "You stayed. I'm not going anywhere. You say that." Something flickered behind her eyes, there and gone. "Everybody says that." "I'm not everybody." "No," she'd agreed, and squeezed his hand once hard, like she was making sure of something. "You're not." He didn't know. Sitting on that porch with the mountains going dark, and her hand warm in his, that in 2 months' time he'd be kneeling in the dirt of that same yard, screaming her name at a horse carrying her off toward a mine he'd never seen, wondering if "I'm not going anywhere" was the kind of promise a man got to keep, or just the kind he got to mean, right up until the world decided otherwise. They had 40 acres and 100 more they didn't own but used anyway because the land didn't much care whose name was on a piece of paper in Tucson. Cattle. A garden Della fought with every summer and mostly won. A well that ran sweet even in the dry months, which the old-timers said meant something, though nobody could agree what. 3 years of mornings like this one. 3 years of Ezra Doyle being a man who fixed fences instead of a man who hunted other men, and he'd just started, to believe the fence around that old part of himself might hold for good. That was the thing about fences, though. They only work until something on the other side wants through worse than the fence wants to keep it out. That morning, though, that last ordinary morning, Ezra spent it on the barn door hinge, same as every small chore that had been piling up all week, the kind of chores a man does slow, on purpose, because the doing of them is its own reward, and there's no rush behind it. Della worked the garden, cursing a patch of squash that had decided, for reasons known only to squash, to die overnight for no cause she could find. Scout supervised from the shade, contributing nothing, satisfied with his contribution regardless. Around 11 she brought him water, stood a minute watching him work, arms crossed, head tilted the way she did when she was deciding whether to tease him. "You're doing that wrong," she said. "I've hung 40 hinges in my life, Della, and every one of them squeaked, probably, on account of you doing it wrong the same way 40 times running. Come hang it yourself then. Maybe I will." But she didn't move, just stood there in the sun with dirt on her knees and her sleeves pushed up, and something in her face had gone quiet and pleased, in a way that had nothing to do with hinges. "It's a good day, it is, I mean it. Not just weather." She looked out past the barn, toward the ridge road, toward the mountains beyond it, gone soft blue in the midday haze. Some days you can feel it before anything happens, like the whole world's holding still on purpose, just to let you notice it. He'd laughed. Told her she was getting fanciful in her old age, and she'd swatted him with the water dipper and gone back to her doomed squash. Their nearest neighbor, a widow named Ruth Whitcomb, who ran 40 head of cattle on the next section over, and considered gossip a public service rather than a vice, had ridden by around mid-morning to trade a basket of late peaches for a jar of Della's preserves, and stayed longer than the trade strictly required, the way she always did. "You hear about the Ironwood Road again?" Ruth had said, settling herself on the porch step like she intended to stay through supper. "Second wagon this month. Crane's men are saying it's Apache raiders, plain and simple, but Mahalis swears up and down it's just the one rider doing it. A woman, if you credit the stories, which Lord knows I don't credit most of what gets said around here, but 3 separate men have told it the same way now, and 3's enough to make even a skeptic wonder." "Wonder what?" Della had asked, only half listening, more interested in the peaches. "Wonder what a person's got to have lost," Ruth said, "to make her willing to do what they're saying she's doing. Nobody rides that kind of trouble for silver alone. There's always a grief under it somewhere. if you dig. Ezra, working the hinge nearby, hadn't said anything, hadn't needed to. But something in Ruth's idle porch gossip had snagged on him anyway, a small burr he couldn't quite brush off, and he'd found himself thinking about it on and off through the rest of the morning, without understanding yet why it wouldn't let him go. Ruth left before noon. Peaches traded. Gossip delivered. Entirely unaware, she'd planted the first seed of a thought that would, by evening, grow into something that swallowed Ezra Doyle's whole world. It was maybe 20 minutes later that he saw the riders. The riders came at midday, when the light was flat and hard and there was nowhere for a shadow to hide. Ezra saw them before he heard them. 4 shapes on the ridge road, moving unhurried, which was somehow worse than if they'd come at a gallop. Men in a hurry wanted something quick. Men who came slow already knew they had all the time they needed. He was in the yard, mending a hinge on the barn door. He set the tool down without deciding to. His hand just did it. Some old part of him waking up before the rest of him caught on. Della. She came to the door, wiping flour off her hands onto her apron, and she saw his face before she saw the riders, and that told her everything. "Get inside," he said. "Get inside now." She didn't argue. That was the other thing about Della. She knew which arguments were worth having, and this wasn't one of them. She went. He heard the bolt slide on the door behind her, and some part of him relaxed. Half an inch, at the sound of it. Half an inch wasn't going to be enough. He just didn't know that yet. He counted them without meaning to. Old habit, older than the farm, older than Della. A habit that had never once fully died, no matter how many years of quiet he'd buried it under. 4 riders. 2 carrying rifles across their saddles, held easy, held ready. 1 leading a 5th horse, saddled but riderless, which was the detail that made something cold drop through Ezra's chest before his mind had even finished the thought that formed it. They brought an extra horse. They came here already planning to take somebody away with them. He didn't call out, didn't wave. Just watched them come, doing the arithmetic every tracker does without deciding to distance, speed, cover, the location of every tool within reach that could double as a weapon if it came to that. The hinge hammer in his hand, 6 feet to the axe by the woodpile, 12 feet to the rifle propped inside the barn door unloaded, because he hadn't touched a loaded gun on this property in 3 years, and some part of him had let himself believe he'd never need to again. 12 feet might as well have been 12 miles. The man in front rode a black gelding with silver on the tack, the kind of silver a man wears when he wants you looking at his horse instead of his eyes. He stopped his mount 20 feet out, didn't dismount. Just sat there, looking down at Ezra the way a man looks at a piece of land he's already decided to buy. "You'd be Doyle. Depends who's asking." "Silas Crane." He said it like it should mean something, waited a beat to see if it did. Ezra's face gave him nothing, and something flickered across Crane's annoyance. Maybe that his own name didn't do the work for him. "I own the ironwood claim. West of here, own the mill. Own most of the men who used to work the mill before I decided which ones I still needed." "Congratulations." Ezra didn't move. "You're a long way from your silver, Mr. Crane." "I am." Crane's eyes went past him, toward the house, toward the bolted door. "And I intend to be a long way from it a while longer, once we've had our conversation." That was when Ezra noticed the 3 men behind Crane weren't looking at him at all. They were looking at the house. It happened fast, the way bad things happen fast when you've spent 3 years letting yourself get slow. 2 of them went for the door, while Crane's gelding sidestepped, easy, like this was a thing he'd rehearsed and the horse already knew its part. Ezra moved, of course he moved. Some instinct 3 years of quiet hadn't managed to farm out of him. 3 long strides toward the house before his body even finished deciding to run. Muscle memory older than the farm, older than Della, surfacing whole and ready the instant it was called on. He didn't make it 4 strides. A 4th rider he hadn't fully accounted for, the one who'd been holding back at the tree line, hat low, a detail Ezra's mind flagged, and then, in the chaos, failed to finish processing, put a rifle stock across the back of his skull before he'd covered half the distance, and the world went white, then red, then a kind of gray static he had to fight his way up out of. He remembered hitting the ground, remembered tasting dirt and copper, remembered dimly, through the ringing, trying to get his hands under him and finding they wouldn't answer, not fast enough, not with the particular kind of not fast enough that a man remembers for the rest of his life as the moment everything slipped past the point where fighting still mattered. He heard the door give. He heard Della's voice, sharp and furious, and not one bit afraid right up until the moment it changed into something else. Something that made his stomach fold in on itself even through the ringing in his ears. "Get off me, get your hands!" A crash! A grunt that wasn't hers. She'd fought. Of course she'd fought. He'd have expected nothing less, and it didn't make it easier to hear. On his knees in the dirt with blood running warm down the back of his neck, unable to do one single thing about any of it. By the time his vision cleared enough to be useful, they had her. One man on each arm. Her lip was split and her eyes were murder, and she was still, God help her, still fighting, even pinned like that, even with 3 days' worth of bruises already rising on her wrists. Ezra Doyle. Crane had gotten down off the horse, crouched in front of him now, close enough that Ezra could smell the pomade in his hair, the good whiskey on his breath. A man who did his violence at arm's length and stayed clean-handed doing it. "You know," Crane said, almost conversational, "I've asked around about you for 3 weeks. Wanted to be sure. Man doesn't get a reputation like yours for nothing, and I don't like paying for legends. I like paying for facts. Let her go." Ezra's voice came out wrong. Wrecked. He didn't recognize it. "I will." Crane smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd never once in his life made a promise he intended to keep on the terms it was offered. "Once you've done a small thing for me. There's no such thing as a small thing when you're the one holding my wife." Fair. Crane didn't look bothered by the correction. Men like him rarely did they collected corrections the way other men collected debts, filing them away for later use. "Let's call it a large thing then, and be honest with each other about the size of it. I won't do it. You haven't heard it yet. I don't need to." Ezra's jaw was tight enough to ache. "I can see the shape of it, standing right in front of me. You want me to hunt somebody. I told you already I don't do that anymore. You did it for 30 years. I stopped." "Men don't stop, Mr. Doyle." Crane said it almost gently, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he's given 100 times before and stopped finding sad around the 40th. "They just find quieter rooms to keep the thing locked in. I'm not asking you to become something new. I'm asking you to open a door you already know the shape of, and I am regrettably in a position to make sure you open it." They dragged him up, tied his hands, marched him into the barn he'd been mending not 20 minutes before, and sat him down hard on an overturned feed bucket. And outside he could hear Della, still fighting, still cursing every one of them by name they hadn't given her, and it took everything he had, everything, every scrap of a man he'd spent 3 years building back up out of nothing not to come apart right there. Crane crouched again, level with him, taking his time. 3 weeks ago, he said, a rider called the Ghost of the Dragoons put an arrow through my brother's throat and burned 2 wagons of silver to slag on the Tres Alamos road. You've heard the stories. Everybody out here has. Apache woman. Rides alone. Kills like she's got God's own permission. Ezra said nothing. "I've sent 5 men after her." Crane held up a hand, counted on his fingers slow like it gave him pleasure. 2 came back and won't speak of it. 3 didn't come back at all. And I am done, Mr. Doyle, sending men who can't do the one thing you can. I don't hunt people anymore. You don't. Crane nodded like this was a reasonable position, one he respected. Understandable. A man builds a nice little life. Wants to keep it. I can appreciate that, truly. I built a nice little life myself, and I intend on keeping it too, which is why I'm sitting in your barn instead of somewhere more comfortable. Your brother, Ezra said. Something in Crane's face shifted just slightly at the word. That's what this is. Not the silver. Not really, the silver's real enough. 2 wagons is 2 wagons. Crane's voice had gone quieter, and for one unguarded second something almost human moved behind his eyes, grief badly disguised as business. But you're not entirely wrong. Daniel was my only brother. Younger by 6 years. I brought him out here myself. Gave him the foreman's job at the mill because our mother asked me to look after him, and I did look after him, right up until the morning an arrow found his throat on a road I'd sent him down. So no, Mr. Doyle. This is not entirely about silver, but grief spends the same as money out here, and I find I have a great deal of both to put toward this particular problem. He stood, walked to the door, looked out at Della, still held, still bleeding a little from the lip, still refusing, God love her, to look anything but furious. 7 days, Crane said without turning around. You bring me proof that woman's dead her body, or something close enough to it, and your wife walks back through that door, same as she walked out of it. You don't. A shrug. Ezra could hear it in his voice even without seeing it. Well, I imagine you already understand what happens if you don't. You son of a... I'd think carefully, Crane said, mild as sun, before you finish that sentence. Considering the company she's about to be keeping. They put Della on a horse. bound her wrists to the horn, gentle enough that Ezra understood it was a message: we can be gentle, or we cannot be, and which one happens is entirely a question of what you do next. And for one terrible second her eyes found his across the yard, and there was no fear in them at all. Just fury. And underneath the fury, something that hurt him worse than any blow he'd taken all day. Trust. She was still trusting him. Even now, even bound to a stranger's saddle with blood on her lip. Ezra, her voice cracked across the yard, raw and clear. Whatever they're asking, don't you dare become something to save me that you can't live with after. Della. I mean it. The horse started moving, and she twisted to keep her eyes on him as long as she could. I didn't marry a killer. I won't be the reason I end up married to one. Then the horse turned, and the barn wall cut her from his sight, and Ezra Doyle knelt in the dirt of his own yard, with his hands still bound, and screamed her name until his throat gave out. And nobody came, and nothing changed, and the wind off the Dragoons kept blowing steady and indifferent, same as it did every morning, same as it would tomorrow, whether or not there was anybody left in that little house to hear it. He heard the hoofbeats fade, counted them without meaning, to old habit again. Always the old habit, the one thing left in him that still worked right when everything else had come apart. 4 riders, 1 extra, moving northwest, toward the Ironwood claim, toward a mine he'd never once had reason to see the inside of, and now couldn't stop picturing: dark tunnels, cold rock, Della somewhere in it with her wrists still raw from the rope. Scout came around the side of the house at some point, sat down next to him in the dirt, pressed his old gray body against Ezra's side, and made a low sound in his throat that wasn't quite a whine. Even the dog understood, in whatever way dogs understand things, that the shape of the world had just changed and wasn't changing back on its own. Ezra didn't cry. He wanted to note that later, when he tried to make sense of the day he didn't cry, not once, not kneeling in the dirt with his throat torn raw from shouting her name. Something in him had gone past crying, into a place flatter and colder and far more dangerous, a place he recognized from a long time ago and had hoped never to visit again. Whatever they're asking, don't you dare become something to save me that you can't live with after. Her voice still ringing in his ears. Already, God help him. Already, he could shape of the promise straining at its edges. Not 20 minutes old, and already being asked to hold more weight than any promise should have to carry. He didn't know yet what he was going to do. He only knew, kneeling there with a half-blind dog, pressed against his ribs and his wife's blood drying on a doorframe 6 feet away, that he was going to do something. That the version of himself who'd spent 3 peaceful years fixing hinges and arguing about cold eggs was already, in some quiet and permanent way, gone. Whatever walked out of that yard in the next hour was going to be somebody else. He just didn't know yet how much of the old Ezra Doyle would still be standing inside him when the 7 days ran out. Miles northwest, in a room cut into rock that never once warmed, no matter the season, Della Doyle sat on a cot with her wrists rope-burned and her jaws set, and did not cry either. They'd put her in a storeroom off the main shaft, walled with timber and iron, the kind of room built to hold silver, not people. And somebody, Crane himself, she suspected, a man who liked his cruelties to come with a bit of theater attached, had left the door unlocked. A message, same as the gentle rope: you could run. You wouldn't get far. Better you understand that now than waste both our time finding out. She'd tested it once, early on, just to know for certain. Found 2 guards posted at the shaft mouth, rifles across their knees, and turned back without a word, filing the layout away, the same patient way. She filed away everything: the number of steps from the storeroom to the shaft, the guard's rotation, that one creak in the 3rd floorboard from the door that gave a person 1 extra half-second of warning before anybody came in. She was afraid. She'd have told anyone honest enough to ask that she was afraid down to the marrow. But fear, in Della Doyle's experience, was a thing you could set beside you, like a tool you weren't using yet, rather than a thing you had to let drive. Crane visited once, that first evening, standing in the doorway with his hat still on, looking at her the way a man looks at collateral rather than a person. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Tears. Begging. Most wives do in your position. I'm not most wives. She didn't get up off the cot, didn't give him the satisfaction of her posture changing 1 inch for his benefit. "And you'll forgive me if I don't perform my terror for your comfort, Mr. Crane. I find I've got precious little energy left over, after all the terror I'm keeping for myself." Something almost like respect flickered across his face, then there and gone. Quick, the way a man's real feelings sometimes surface before he remembers to put the mask back on. "Your husband's a remarkable tracker, they tell me." My husband's a good man who used to do a terrible job and stopped because he decided he didn't want to be the kind of man that job made him. You've dragged him back into it against his will. And I hope, Mr. Crane, that whatever you're paying yourself for this, whatever silver you think it's worth, turns out to cost you considerably more than you're budgeting for." He left without answering. She counted that, too, as a small victory, the kind you had to take where you found them. In a room like this, with days like this one stacked up ahead of her, unknown and unnumbered. She lay back on the cot once he was gone and allowed herself, finally, alone in the dark, 30 seconds of something close to tears. Not for herself. For Ezra, riding out somewhere into country that had already cost him more than she fully understood, carrying a debt on her behalf that she had never once asked him to carry and would have refused had he asked her first to let him carry alone. "Don't you dare become something you can't live with," she'd told him, meant every word. She only hoped, lying there in the dark with the mountains cold coming up through the stone, that meaning a thing, and being able to keep it, were destined to turn out to be the same. They cut him loose an hour later. Left him a horse not his own. A poor one, on purpose, he understood. Another small cruelty stacked on the pile of week's provisions, and a folded paper with a crude map marking the last place the ghost of the Dragoons had struck. And they left him one more thing. A man. He hadn't noticed him at first. One of Crane's riders had hung back the whole time, hat low, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching from the tree line, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. It was only when the others rode out that this one stayed. Dismounted. Walked toward the barn slow, the way you walk toward a dog you're not sure will bite. Ezra's head came up, and something in his chest, already torn clean through today, tore a second time. No, no. He was on his feet now, fist closed so hard his nails cut his palms. And he didn't care, didn't feel it, because standing in front of him, hat in his hands like a man at a funeral, was Cyrus Calloway. They'd served together. 6 years. Ezra had pulled Cyrus out from under a collapsed wall at Rimrock Pass with his own 2 hands, half carried him 9 miles through country and wanted them both dead, and never once, not one single time in 6 years, had he thought the day would come where Cyrus Calloway rode into his yard with Silas Crane's men and stood by while they dragged his wife onto a horse. He could still see that day too, if he let himself, though it was a memory with a very different weight than the canyon camp. An old stone stage station wall, half collapsed already from years of weather, come down the rest of the way when a mortar round meant for somebody else caught it wrong. Cyrus had been standing against it giving orders. Cyrus was always giving orders, even young, even scared. It was just how he was built, and the whole thing had folded down on top of him, like God's own hand closing a book. Ezra had dug with his fingers until they bled. Every other man on that detail had already written Cyrus off, moved on to positions that made tactical sense, and Ezra had stayed because some part of him had already decided a long time before that day that leaving a man under rubble while he still had breath in him wasn't a math problem, it was a plain question of what kind of man you intended to be. He'd found Cyrus's hand first, gripped it, felt it grip back, weak but there, and something in Ezra's chest had cracked open with relief so total, it had nearly undone him worse than the digging had. "Don't you let go," he remembered shouting, over gunfire and dust and a ringing in his own ears that didn't quit for 2 days after. "You hear me, Calloway. Don't you dare let go of my hand." Cyrus hadn't let go. Ezra had pulled him clear, half carried him 9 miles through country, lousy with riders who wanted them both dead, and by the time they reached the column, Cyrus had a broken collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, and a debt he'd sworn, half delirious with pain, he intended to spend the rest of his life paying back. "I owe you everything, Doyle," he remembered Cyrus saying, that first clear night after, voice still thick with fever. "You hear me? Anything you ever need, anything at all, you come find me." Ezra had laughed it off then, told him to save the speeches for men who'd actually died. He hadn't thought, not for 1 second in 6 years, that the day would come where he'd need to collect on it, and never in 1,000 years would he have guessed it would be collected in his own yard, over the sight of Della's split lip, against a debt that ran in exactly the wrong direction. "You were with them." Ezra's voice had gone flat. Flat was worse than shouting. Flat meant he'd already used up the part of himself that knew how to shout, the whole time. "You sat that horse and watched." "I swear to you, Ezra, I didn't lay one hand." "You watched." Cyrus flinched like he'd been hit. "Good." Ezra hoped it hurt. I didn't have a choice. Everybody's got a choice, Cyrus. Something ugly was rising in Ezra now, something he hadn't let off its chain in 3 years. And it felt, God help him, almost like relief to let it slip its leash a little. You just made yours a long time before today. Cyrus's jaw worked. He looked, for a second, like a much younger man like the boy Ezra had dragged out from under that wall, scared and gray-faced and certain he was going to die. Crane's had papers on me since '79, he said, low. Desertion papers. Real ones, filed proper, my name on them in ink that don't wash out. Man like that finds a man like me, he doesn't offer money first. He offers silence, and I took it. I took the silence, Ezra, because I've got a wife of my own and 2 little graves behind a church in Benson, and I was not about to give her a third. Ezra hadn't known about the graves. 6 years apart from a man does that lets whole griefs happen in the gap. Whole chapters you never get told because there's never a right moment to bring them up over coffee. Twin girls, Cyrus told him now, voice gone thin. Born too early in a winter so hard the ground wouldn't take a proper grave for 11 days. His wife, Faye, had barely spoken above a whisper for the better part of a year after. Cyrus had walked off the family's little plot near Benson not long after that desertion, on paper, though what it had really been was a man running from a house that had turned into a museum of everything he'd lost, before he'd found his way to laboring for men like Crane, keeping his head down, keeping the desertion papers buried, keeping Faye fed on wages he'd stopped being proud of years back. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me, Cyrus said. I'm telling you because you asked me to say it plain, and plain is, I've already buried 2 of my own, Ezra, and the thought of Crane using that same kind of grief against your wife, I told myself it was different because it wasn't my hands on the rope. But grief's grief. A hostage is a hostage. And a coward's excuse don't get less cowardly just because the man making it has got his own graves to point at. So you sold me instead. I told him where you were. Cyrus's voice cracked. I didn't know what he'd do with it. I swear on those graves I did not know I thought it'd be money. A job. Not this, not her. You watched them drag her onto a horse, Cyrus. I know what I did. Say it, then. Say what you did. I want to hear you say it plain, not dressed up in whatever you've been telling yourself the whole ride out here to make it fit inside a man you can still stand to be. Cyrus's jaw worked. For a moment Ezra thought he might actually turn and walk away rather than answer, and some ugly part of him almost wanted that. Wanted an excuse to let the fury off its leash all the way. No complications. No 6 years of history standing in the road. But Cyrus didn't walk away. I sat my horse, he said low. Each word dragged out like it cost him something to produce, and I watched 2 men put their hands on your wife. And I told myself it wasn't my hands doing it, so maybe it wasn't my sin. And I know, Ezra, before you say it, I know that's the same lie every coward's told himself since Cain. Doesn't make it less true that I told it to myself anyway. Doesn't make me less of what I am for having told it. But you knew, Ezra said, you knew what I could do. That's why he wanted my name in the first place, isn't it? Not just any tracker. Me. Cyrus didn't answer right away. And the silence answered for him, in the particular way silence does when a man's got more to say and hasn't found the courage to say it. There's something else, he finally said. Something Crane didn't tell you in that barn, and something you deserve to hear from somebody who was there. 'Cause I was there, Ezra. Same as you. Ezra went very still there. As what? You remember 76, the detail out past Bitter Spring Pass. The one General Whitfield sent us on said it was rounding up hostiles that had broken from the agency. Cyrus wouldn't meet his eyes now. You remember how it went bad. How we didn't just round anybody up. Ezra's stomach dropped through the floor of the world. He remembered it the way he remembered the canyon camp, which was to say completely, in a detail that never once dimmed no matter how many years he tried to bury it under. Same detail. He understood now, staring at Cyrus in the ruin of his own yard. The same terrible morning he'd spent 3 years teaching himself not to look at directly. He remembered the camp waking slow in gray light. Remembered a young man couldn't have been past 25, stepping in front of a lodge, with nothing in his hands but the plain fact of standing where he stood, because 11 armed men had ridden into a place he considered his to protect, and something in him had refused, at the very last, to simply step aside and let it happen. Ezra remembered a shout, a single shot, not his own, fired by a man to his left whose name he'd spent 6 years trying to forget and had never once succeeded. He remembered the young man falling, and the camp erupting into a chaos of screaming and scattering that 11 trained men were entirely too well equipped to control, and he remembered at the very edge of it, a woman, young, quick, She hadn't frozen the way most people froze in the first shocked seconds of a thing like that. She'd moved instantly, instinctively, toward the fallen man, and Ezra, even now, 6 years later, standing in his own yard, with his hands still marked from rope, could recall with terrible clarity the sound she'd made. Not a scream, something lower than a scream. Something that had gone straight through the noise of gunfire and shouting men and lodged itself, whole, in a part of Ezra's memory that had never once let it go, no matter how many good mornings he'd stacked up on top of it since. She'd been pulled back by an older woman, an aunt, maybe, or a mother dragged bodily into the rocks while she fought the whole way, still reaching back toward the man on the ground, and by the time the detail had reassembled itself enough to give chase, she was gone, vanished into country that had raised her, and would apparently go on protecting her for years to come. Lieutenant Whitfield had written it up that evening by lamplight, Ezra remembered, in handwriting so neat and unbothered, it had turned Ezra's stomach worse than the morning itself had. One hostile escaped pursuit, detail otherwise successful. 11 words for a young man's whole life filed away in a ledger. Nobody but the Army would ever read. Nobody had thought it worth chasing a lone woman through that country. Nobody had thought about her again at all. As far as Ezra knew, not the Army, not Whitfield, certainly not Ezra himself, who'd spent the following weeks building the first boards of the fence he'd go on, adding to for the next 6 years, board by board, until he'd convinced himself the thing behind it had gone quiet for good. He understood now, standing in his ruined yard with the taste of old iron in his mouth, that it had never gone quiet at all. It had simply gone somewhere he couldn't see it, into rock and shadow in the Dragoon Mountains, where a young widow had spent 6 years turning grief into something the whole territory now told stories about in low, frightened voices. He remembered. God help him. He remembered every second of it, had spent 3 years building a fence around exactly that memory, and calling the fence a farm, a wife, a life, the wash, the blood on his hands that wasn't his. A man he'd tracked to a canyon camp because that was the job, because orders were orders, because at 30 years old he still believed there was a difference between a soldier and a killer, and found out in the space of about 4 minutes that there wasn't. One, not really, not when the orders were bad enough and you followed them anyway. There was a woman there, Cyrus said, and his voice had gone to almost nothing. Young, married about a year from what the interpreter said after. Her husband put up a fight when we came through the camp and stop. I think you already know what happened to him, Ezra. I think some part of you has known it for 6 years and just never had a face to put on it. I said stop. The woman got away. Cyrus finally looked up, and his eyes were wet, and Ezra had never in 6 years of war and 3 years of peace seen Cyrus Calloway cry, not once, not even at Rimrock Pass with a wall on top of him. Ran into the rocks before anybody could stop her. Whitfield wrote it up as one hostile escaped, didn't think it worth chasing down a lone woman in that country. Everybody moved on. Everybody except, I'm guessing, her. The wind was still blowing. Ezra could hear it. Could hear it the way you hear something from very far away, underwater, through a fog that had rolled into his skull and didn't seem inclined to roll back out. The ghost of the Dragoons, he said. Not a question, he already knew. I can't prove it, Cyrus said. Crane don't know it, or if he does, he's never once said so out loud. Not to me. But I've turned it over every night since his brother caught that arrow. Same country. Same years since the husband died. Same kind of fury that doesn't run out. It's just what's left of a person after the furies had 6 years to set like concrete. He shook his head. I think Crane's asking you to hunt down a woman your own unit made a widow, Ezra. And I think he doesn't have the first idea he's doing it. And I think I owe you the truth of that, even if it don't change one single thing about the position you're in. Ezra sat down in the dirt. Not because his legs gave out, though they nearly did, because there was nowhere else, in that whole ruined yard, that felt like it would hold him up. Because if Cyrus was right, then the woman he'd been ordered to hunt and kill inside 7 days wasn't some faceless outlaw who'd earned Crane's silver-plated wrath for its own sake. She was a woman who'd lost a husband to men wearing the same uniform Ezra used to wear, standing in a line he used to stand in, following orders he used to follow without asking hard enough what they cost. Which meant the debt here didn't run one direction. It never had. Which meant if he found her when he found her, because there was no version of this where Della's life let him choose not to, he wouldn't just be a stranger sent to kill a stranger. He'd be walking into the wreckage of something he'd helped cause, and asking her, at the point of whatever he decided to point at her, to forgive him for it by dying quietly. His mind kept trying to find a door out of it, kept circling the way a man circles a locked room looking for a window he's already checked twice. Because maybe Cyrus was wrong. Because 6 years was a long time, and grief did strange things to a story in the retelling, and maybe the ghost of the Dragoons was just some other woman entirely unconnected, and Cyrus's guilt had simply gone looking for a shape big enough to hold it and found this one because it was close at hand. Except the timing fit too clean. Except the country fit too clean, the stretch of mountains. The same range a young woman with nowhere else to run would have known better than any soldier chasing her. Except 6 years was exactly long enough for a wound like that to stop being a wound and start being a purpose instead. And Ezra had seen that transformation before, in other people, in other wars, and knew the shape of it, the way he knew the shape of everything else in this business he'd sworn off and was apparently never quite done with. So he had a debt with her name on it before he'd ever heard her name, which was a thought so large and so wrong-shaped that it didn't fit anywhere sensible in his chest, and he sat there in the dirt turning it over anyway, because turning things over slow was the only skill he had left that felt like it might be worth anything in the next 7 days. Until he understood finally, sitting there with the light going long and gold across the yard, that there was only one honest way through this. Not around it, not past it, through it, straight through the middle, carrying both debts at once, the one he owed Della, and the one, it turned out, he'd apparently owed a stranger in the mountains for 6 years, without ever knowing her name. He would find her. He would not kill her. He did not yet know how both of those things could be true at the same time, with Della's life sitting on the other side of the scale. He only knew that the moment he stopped believing, both were possible. He'd already lost something he wasn't willing to lose. The part of himself Della had married, the part that had sworn on a porch 2 months back that he wasn't everybody, that when he said, "I'm not going anywhere," he'd meant the whole of himself, and not just the parts that were convenient to keep. "Ezra," Cyrus's voice, "careful now, say something." "What do you want me to say? I don't know. I've been carrying this 6 years, and I still don't know what a man's supposed to say about it." Ezra looked up. Looked at the man who'd betrayed his address to a killer, who'd sat a horse and watched his wife dragged off it, who'd one pulled him free of a wall by shouting his name until Ezra found the strength to crawl toward the sound of it. Hard to hate a man clean when you'd loved him first. Harder still when the thing he'd done and the thing he was confessing were tangled up together, so tight you couldn't cut one loose from the other without bleeding both. "I want you to help me," Ezra said finally. Cyrus blinked. "Help you hunt her? Help me find her before Crane's other men do, because if what you're telling me is true, then there's exactly one man in this territory who might be able to talk to her instead of just shoot at her." Ezra got to his feet, slow like a man twice his age. "And it isn't going to be one of Crane's." "Ezra, I can't. Crane finds out." "Told you." "Then don't let him find out." Something in Ezra's voice had gone iron, the same iron it used to carry 6 years ago, in a uniform, before he learned what iron like that could do in the wrong hands. "You owe me 6 days off that wall, Cyrus. You owe Della every hair on her head that gets touched while she's sitting in Crane's mine as collateral. And you're going to start paying some of it back today, or so help me. Betrayal or not, I will finish what that wall in Rimrock Pass started." Cyrus looked at him a long moment, then slow, he nodded. "There's a supply trail," he said, "west side of the stronghold. Crane's men use it moving silver, and it's the same country your ghost keeps hitting. If she's watching anybody, she's watching that road. I can get you close without Crane's other riders knowing you had help. That's a start. It's not absolution, Ezra." "No." Ezra was already moving toward the barn, toward the poor horse they'd left him, toward the folded map with its crude ink, marking a place he was supposed to go die, trying to kill a woman who'd already lost more than he had. "It's not. But it's what we've got. And we're 7 days from Della not having any more days at all, so you and I are going to have plenty of time to hate each other on the ride. Right now I need a tracker's eyes, and God help me, yours are the only ones I trust not to shoot first." Cyrus unfolded Crane's map, held it up to what was left of the light, and made a face like a man reading a menu written by somebody who'd never actually eaten food. "This is garbage," he said. "Whoever drew this has never once set foot past the stronghold. This creek's marked wrong. This ridge don't exist. And this," he tapped a spot marked with a small crude X. "This is either where the last wagon burned, or it's where somebody spilled their coffee on the paper and decided to call it a landmark. Helpful. I'm being helpful. I'm telling you we're better off burning this and going by what's actually in my head, which unlike this map has been up that trail more times than I care to count. Your head's gotten us into this mess once already today. That's fair. Cyrus folded the map anyway, tucked it away rather than discard it, the practical habit of a man who'd learned the hard way, that even bad information sometimes beats none. But my head also knows where Crane's other riders like to water their horses, which patrol schedule the Ironwood Guards keep, and which of Crane's foremen can be bought cheap if it ever comes to that. So maybe hold off writing me off as useless until we're at least a full day in one day. One day, just terms, considering the morning I've given you. Despite everything, despite the ache still radiating from the back of his skull, despite Della's face still burned behind his eyes every time he blinked, despite a debt now doubled in size and running in two directions, at once something almost like the old easiness between them flickered back to life for just a moment, thin as a struck match in a high wind, gone again almost as fast as it came. "How's Faye?" Ezra asked, quieter now, because some questions only fit in the gaps between the larger ones. "Scared, probably, by the time word gets to her that I rode off with Crane's men and didn't come home." Cyrus's jaw tightened. "I left her a note. Didn't tell her the truth of it, couldn't, not on paper, not with what I'm risking telling you the truth of it out loud. Just told her I had work up north. She's used to me disappearing on Crane's business. Doesn't mean she likes it. You could still turn back." "I could." Cyrus met his eyes, steady. "For the first time since he'd ridden into the yard that afternoon, I'm not going to. I already told you why. Some debts a man's got to pay in person, Ezra, or they just keep drawing interest till they bury him." They finished loading the second horse in near silence after that, the practical business of rope and canteen and the last of the farm's dried beef, and by the time the light had gone properly golden long across the yard, there was nothing left to do but leave. He went into the house before he left. Had to. Some things a man can't ride away from without doing first, even with a clock running against him. The flour was still dusted across the floorboards. The bread still sat on the board, half-shaped, going stiff. Scout was curled in the doorway to the bedroom, refusing to move, like if he just stayed put long enough, the day would rearrange itself back into something that made sense. Ezra crouched and put a hand on the old dog's head. "I know," he said, quiet. "I know, boy. I don't understand it either." He found what he was looking for in the small chest by the bed. A photograph taken 2 summers back by a traveling man with a wagon full of glass plates who'd charged them 50 cents and grumbled the whole time about the wind ruining his exposures. Della hadn't wanted to smile for it, thought smiling for a photograph looked foolish. Some vanity she'd never quite shaken from her mother, but the man had said something to make her laugh right as the plate exposed, and so there she was, caught forever mid-law, eyes bright, looking like herself in a way most formal photographs never managed. He folded it into oilcloth, put it inside his shirt, against his chest, where he could feel the corner of it with every breath. Then he found her sewing kit, and beside it, half finished, a quilt square she'd been working on for months, a wedding gift for her sister back in Ohio. Still 2 years off from needing it, worked on slow in the evenings while he read or dozed by the fire. He didn't take the quilt square. Just looked at it a long moment, the careful stitches, the pattern she'd chosen and unpicked, and 3 separate times, because she wanted it right. "I didn't marry a killer," she'd said. "I won't be the reason I end up married to one." He set the quilt square down gentle like it might break and went back out into the yard where Cyrus waited with the horses. Small things. That's what a life turns out to be made of when somebody rips it open fast enough that you can see all the way to the studs. Not the big declarations. The bread on the board, the hinge he'd been fixing when the riders came, the particular sound of her laugh from someplace low in her chest. He thought about the fence he'd built around the tracker he used to be. 3 years of good, quiet mornings, stacked up like rails, and Crane had ridden through it like it was made of nothing at all. Because it was. Fences only hold when nothing wants through bad enough. And now here he was, riding back out into the exact country he'd sworn he was done with, hunting a woman whose grief he might have helped authors 6 years before he ever knew her name, carrying a debt on both sides of the ledger that no 7 days on God's earth was going to let him pay clean. Ezra, Cyrus already mounted, waiting at the tree line. "You ready?" He wasn't. He didn't think he'd ever be ready for this. Not if he lived to be 100 and spent every year of it apologizing. But Della's voice was still in his ears. "Don't you dare become something to save me that you can't live with after." And he understood, mounting the poor horse in the ruin of his own yard, that the hardest job in front of him wasn't tracking a ghost through the Dragoon mountains. It was finding a way to save his wife without becoming the very thing she'd begged him not to become. He didn't know yet if both of those were possible at once. He turned the horse west, toward the mountains, toward the last light of a day that had started with coffee going cold in the wind and was ending with his whole life bent sideways around a 7-day clock, and he rode. Behind him, the bread on the board went stiff and forgotten. They made camp that first night in a fold of rock 2 hours shy of the stronghold, a spot Cyrus knew from his silver hauling days, sheltered enough for a small fire that wouldn't carry its light far. Neither man had much appetite. They ate anyway because a body on a 7-day clock didn't get the luxury of skipping meals over feelings. The fire popped. Somewhere off in the dark, a coyote tried out a few notes and thought better of finishing the song. "You ever hear how she got the name?" Cyrus said eventually, not looking up from the flames. "The ghost part, I mean. Everybody knows the Dragoons part, that's just where she works. The ghost part's got a story behind it. I've heard 3 different ones. Never trusted any of them. Man I know swore she walked straight through a line of 6 riflemen at Turkey Creek without taking a scratch. Bullets just went around her, is how he told it. Man was drunk when he told it, mind, but he swore it sober, the next morning too, which is more conviction than most drunk stories manage to keep. Bullets don't go around people, Cyrus." "No." Cyrus turned a stick over in the coals, watching the end catch, "but fear does strange things to what a frightened man thinks he saw. I expect the truth simpler and worse. I expect she's just faster and smarter than the men Crane keeps sending, and faster and smarter, in country like this, looks like magic to somebody who's never had to survive on those 2 things alone." Ezra stared into the fire a long while before he spoke again. "I keep thinking about the husband," he said finally. Quiet, like saying it too loud might make it more true than it already was. 20-some years old. Stood in front of a lodge because 11 armed men rode in, and something in him wouldn't let him just step aside. That's not the act of a coward, Cyrus. That's not the act of anybody I'd have wanted dead, if I'd known him, instead of just finding the camp for men who did. You didn't pull a trigger that morning." "I found the door." Ezra's jaw tightened. "I told you already, I've had 6 years to make my peace with the difference between those 2 things, and some nights the peace holds, and some nights it doesn't, and tonight it very much does not." Cyrus didn't offer anything to that. Some silences, Ezra had learned a long time ago, are kinder left unfilled. "What happens," Cyrus said eventually, "if you find her before Crane's other riders do? If you get the chance to talk instead of shoot? What do you even say to a woman like that, Ezra?" "Sorry my old unit killed your husband. Now would you mind dying quiet so my wife gets to live?" "I don't know. That's not comforting." "I didn't say it to comfort you." Ezra lay back against his saddle, hat tipped over his eyes, though sleep felt like a country as far off as anywhere he'd ever tracked a man through. "I said it because it's true, and I'm done lying to either one of us tonight. I don't know what I say to her. I don't know if there's anything a man can say, standing on the wrong side of a debt like that adds up to enough. I only know I'm going to have to find out, and I'd rather find out with my eyes open than pretend the arithmetic's simpler than it is." The fire popped again. Somewhere above them, the first hard stars of the night came out over the black shoulders of the Dragoons, indifferent as ever to the plans of the small, frightened, stubborn creatures moving through the dark beneath them. Ahead of him, somewhere in rock and shadow that didn't care one bit about any human being's grief, a woman who'd buried a husband because of men like the one he used to be, was already, he was almost certain, watching the road, waiting to see who Crane would send next. Not knowing yet that this time, it was a man who might already owe her more than he could ever hope to repay, and who was going to spend every one of the next 6 days finding out whether that debt could be paid at all, or whether some debts, once incurred, simply have to be carried the rest of the way, uncollected, into whatever came after. The trail took them up before it took them anywhere else, up through country that didn't care one bit about a man's 7-day clock. Rock, scrub, wind that never once let that fire burn easy. Ezra read sign the way he used to read it, automatic, unhurried, a skill that had never actually left him no matter how many years he'd told himself otherwise, which was the first thing that scared him, because he expected rust, expected his eye to have gone soft, his hands to have forgotten the old weight of tracking gear. Instead, the old sharpness came back inside of an hour, easy as breathing, like the farm had only ever been a pause and not a change. Until he understood something worse, something that sat cold in his chest the whole first day. He was good at this because he'd never actually stopped being the man who was good at this. He'd only stopped doing it which meant the fence hadn't held because the fence was strong. It had held because nothing had come along to test it, and now something had, and the whole 3 years behind him felt suddenly thin as paper, a story he'd told himself about a man he'd hoped to become, standing on nothing sturdier than good intentions and Della's steady hand on his. He thought about her constantly. Couldn't help it. Every mile put behind him was a mile further from the last place he'd seen her face, and closer. He had to keep reminding himself, to whatever this trail was going to demand of him, before it let him turn back around and go find her again. He counted the days without meaning to, the way a man counts anything that's actively bleeding time out of a wound he can't close. 6 left then. 5. The number sat behind his ribs like a stone he couldn't put down. The land out here hadn't changed in 6 years. That was its own strange comfort, and its own strange cruelty. At once the same red rock, the same scrub brush clinging stubborn to slopes too steep for anything sensible to grow, the same particular blue, the sky turned an hour before real dusk. Country didn't remember what men did in it. Country just kept being country, indifferent, patient, outlasting every grief and every crime committed on its face, by however many decades it took the wind to finish wearing the evidence away. Cyrus found the first sign before noon. A hoofprint half erased pressed into soft ground near a dry wash. One rider, he said. Unshod horse, moving slow. She's not running. Ezra crouched over it, fingers hovering an inch above the print without touching, the way he'd been taught 30 years back. She's leading us where? Oh, that's the question, isn't it? They rode on. The land climbed. By mid-afternoon, the print appeared again, same horse, same unhurried pace, always just far enough ahead to stay a story instead of a target. Ezra felt it before he could name it, a weight on the back of his neck, the particular pressure of being watched by something that had already decided how the watching would end. She's here, he said. Where, I don't know, but she's here. He scanned the ridgeline, the boulders, the shadow pockets that could hide a rifle, a bow, a woman who'd spent 6 years learning this ground better than any man chasing her ever would. I can feel it. Cyrus didn't argue. 6 years of war teaches a man not to argue with a good tracker's gut, even when the gut hasn't got proof yet to back it up. They made a cold camp that first night, no fire at all, and Ezra lay awake long after Cyrus's breathing had gone slow and even, staring up at more stars than any man rightly deserved to see. Turning the day's sign over and over in his mind the way he used to before sleep would finally take him, back when this had been his whole life, instead of a life he'd walked away from. Somewhere out there, closer than felt comfortable, a woman was doing the exact same thing, lying awake, turning over what she'd seen of him today, deciding, mile by careful mile, whether he was worth the trouble of a clean death or a slow one. He didn't sleep much either. The second evening, before the trail turned strange, Cyrus surprised him with a laugh. First one either of them had managed since the yard, since Della, since the whole world tipped sideways. They were arguing about coffee, of all things. Cyrus had burned it, properly burned it, the kind of burn that turned water into something closer to tar, and defended the result with the wounded dignity of a man who'd clearly been making terrible coffee his whole career, and never once been told so to his face. This is an insult to the bean, Ezra said, spitting a mouthful back into the fire. It'll keep you awake. Cyrus, a rattlesnake bite would keep me awake. That's not the standard I was hoping for. You want good coffee, you should have married a woman who makes it instead of one who argues with mules. Della makes fine coffee. Della makes coffee strong enough to strip paint, and you drink it every morning like it's manna, so don't you dare criticize mine. Ezra almost smiled. Actually almost did it, for the first time since the yard, before he caught himself and remembered. With the guilty jolt a man feels laughing in the middle of a catastrophe. Exactly why laughing felt like a luxury he hadn't earned yet. Cyrus caught the shift in his face, understood it without being told. You're allowed to breathe, Ezra, he said. Quieter now. Della wouldn't want you carrying this whole thing like it's a debt you're not allowed one single moment's relief from. That's not strength. That's just a slower way of breaking. Since when did you get wise? Since I buried 2 daughters and learned the hard way that grief doesn't respect a schedule, and neither does the occasional bad joke about coffee. Cyrus poked at the fire. Doesn't mean the grief isn't real. Just means a man's got to let a little light in around the edges of it, or the whole thing collapses in on him eventually. Ezra didn't answer that directly. Just sat with it a while, the fire popping, the terrible coffee cooling in his cup, and let himself, for exactly as long as it took the flames to burn down an inch, believe that Cyrus might be right. Then the thought of Della came back. It always came back, sooner or later, uninvited, insistent, and the moment of light closed back over, and Ezra, once again, entirely and only a man on a clock. Because the second day was worse. Because on the second day, the sign started doing things sign wasn't supposed to do, doubling back on itself, crossing false trails that led nowhere. That ate an hour, 2 hours, before Ezra caught the trick of it and swore out loud, alone, into rock that didn't answer. She's not just leading us, he said that evening, jaw tight. She's testing us. Testing for what? I don't know yet. He stared into the small fire they'd allowed themselves, low and smokeless, tucked against a rock face that wouldn't throw the light far. Whether we're worth the trouble of killing quick or slow. Cyrus said nothing to that. There wasn't anything worth saying. The trap came on the third day, and it nearly ended everything before it properly began. Ezra was leading his horse through a narrow defile, rock walls, close enough to touch on either side. The kind of ground a smart tracker hates and crosses anyway, because there's rarely another way through when the horse screamed and reared, and the ground gave way beneath its front hooves like it had never been ground at all. A pit, covered, disguised, dug with a patience that turned Ezra's stomach, even as he threw himself backward off the saddle and hit rock hard enough to lose his breath entirely. He lay there a moment, just breathing, just understanding. In the flat, unhurried way a man understands things right after nearly dying. How close nearly had actually come to not being the operative word. His ears rang. His hands, when he finally looked at them, were shaking in a way 3 years of quiet had let him forget hands could shake. Ezra. Cyrus scrambling down from his own mount. You hit? He tried to sit up, stopped. Tried again, slower. I'm alive. Which is more than I was expecting 30 seconds ago. His horse was screaming still, one leg twisted wrong in the collapsed pit, and the sound of it pure animal panic. No words to soften it was worse, somehow, than the fall itself had been. Cyrus went to work calming the animal while Ezra sat in the dirt and tried to remember how his own lungs were supposed to work. Something moved at the top of the defile, a shadow against the sky, gone before either man could raise a rifle. She'd been watching. Of course she'd been watching. She'd dug the pit herself, most likely, or found it already dug by weather and simply improved on it, and she'd been sitting somewhere close enough to see whether the fall killed him outright. It hadn't. Ezra understood, lying in the dirt with his horse still shrieking somewhere behind him, that this was information, that a woman who wanted him dead quick had a dozen easier ways to manage it than a covered pit in a defile. A rifle from the ridgeline would have finished it in a heartbeat. An arrow in the dark on either of the last 2 nights would have finished it just as easy. Instead, a pit. Survivable if a man was fast enough. Painful, but not fatal. This was something closer to a message. I could have killed you already. I haven't. Ask yourself why. He turned the thought over for the rest of that day, working it the way he used to work sign, looking for the shape underneath the shape, and by evening, riding slower now on a horse, gone lame in the front leg, he'd arrived at an answer that unsettled him more than any of the fear had. She wasn't testing whether he could survive her. She was testing whether he deserved to. Night came down fast, that fourth day, the way it does in high country, daylight one moment and stars the next with almost nothing honest in between. They built a fire bigger than they should have. Ezra's decision over Cyrus's objection. You want her to find us. I want her to see us. Ezra fed another branch into the flames, hands steady even though nothing else in him felt steady at all. There's a difference, Cyrus. Finding is what hunters do. Seeing is what you let happen when you've got nothing to hide. And if she puts an arrow through your throat the second she sees you clear, then I suppose we'll have our answer a lot faster than 7 days. Cyrus didn't like it. Said so, twice, in increasingly colorful language, and then said nothing at all for a long while, watching the fire with the stillness of a man keeping his objections to himself, because he'd already lost the argument and knew it. Ezra sat with his back to a rock, rifle across his knees but not held, not aimed, a deliberate looseness he hoped read as invitation rather than carelessness. He thought about Della, thought about the photograph folded in oilcloth against his chest, and resisted barely the urge to take it out and look at it, because some things a man needed to keep whole in the dark rather than risk to firelight and a stranger's eyes. He waited, the fire cracked. An owl somewhere off in the rocks asked its question twice and got no answer either time, and somewhere past midnight without a single sound to announce her, she was simply there, at the edge of the firelight. Not close. Close enough. Ezra's breath caught somewhere behind his ribs. She was younger than the stories made her, and older than her face at the same time, 30-some years, carried in a body that had learned, a long time ago, exactly how much of itself to spend and how much to keep in reserve. A rifle across her back she didn't reach for. Eyes that found his and held there, steady, unreadable, asking a question neither of them had words for yet. He didn't move. Didn't reach for anything either. Cyrus beside him had gone rigid as a fence post, one hand frozen halfway to his own rifle. Ezra put a hand out, slow, without looking away from her. Don't, Cyrus understood. Didn't move again. For a long moment, 10 seconds, 30, he genuinely couldn't have said. Time had gone strange, and thick neither of them did anything at all. Just looked. Just let the fire crack and pop between them, throwing orange light across a distance that felt somehow both enormous and entirely too small. He wanted to speak, wanted to say her name, or the name he'd only heard secondhand. Wanted to say, I know what happened to your husband, and I am so sorry, and a dozen other things that all felt, in the moment, both entirely true and entirely inadequate to the size of what they were meant to hold. He said none of it. Something in her stillness told him that any word spoken too soon would end this before it had properly begun. Then she was gone. Not a sound, not a shifted pebble. Just gone, the way smoke is there and then isn't. And Ezra sat by that fire a long while after, chest hammering, trying to understand what exactly had just passed between them, because it hadn't felt like the opening move of a killing. It had felt like curiosity. And curiosity, he understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, was a far more dangerous thing to have earned from her than hatred would have been. Hatred, at least, was simple. Ezra. Cyrus's voice low, once she'd been gone long enough to trust it wouldn't carry. You saw her face. I saw it. And? Ezra stared into the fire a long moment before he answered. And she doesn't look like a killer, Cyrus. She looks like a woman who's had to become one, which is an entirely different animal, and I am starting to think Crane never once understood the difference, or understood it and didn't care. The fifth day gave him the truth, or the first real piece of it. They found the wagon 2 miles off the main supply road, tipped and burned days back, silver scattered black and useless across the rocks where the heat had ruined it. Ezra had expected that much. Crane's story, more or less, matched the wreckage. What he hadn't expected was the second wagon behind it. Smaller, bared, empty now. But not empty in the way a wagon is empty when it never carried anything. Empty in the way a room is empty after something terrible has happened in it and been cleared away, chains still bolted to the floorboards, worn smooth at specific points that told Ezra exactly what kind of use they'd seen. A child's shoe small enough to fit in his palm wedged into a floor gap where it had gone unnoticed in whatever hurry had emptied the wagon out. Ezra. Cyrus's voice had gone very quiet. What is this? It's not silver. Ezra's hands weren't steady anymore. He noticed that distantly, the way you notice things about your own body, when the rest of you is somewhere else entirely. He climbed down, walked the length of the wagon bed slow, reading it the only way he knew how to read anything, sign, where, the story ground into wood and iron by whoever had suffered inside it. Or it's not only silver. Crane's not just running silver up that road, Cyrus. He's running people. You don't know that. I know chains when I see them bolted to a floor. His voice had gone hard flat, the same flatness that had scared him about himself once, years back, in a canyon he still dreamed about. I know what a shoe that size means, left behind in a hurry. I've seen this before, different war. Same sickness. He crouched by the chains a long while, ran a thumb over the worn iron. Somewhere in his chest, something that had been sitting uneasy since Ruth Whitcomb's porch gossip finally settled into a shape. He could no longer avoid looking at directly. Understanding arrived slow, then all at once. The way a landslide arrives, a few pebbles first, and then the whole mountainside deciding at once. She wasn't burning silver wagons out of spite. She was burning slave wagons, freeing whoever Crane's men had chained inside them. And the silver, was just what happened to be riding along. Collateral in a war she was fighting for reasons that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with people Ezra had, until this exact moment, been willing to consider collateral of his own kind. I've been hunting the wrong story, he said mostly to himself. Crane told me a story about a killer, and I believed enough of it to ride out here, because believing it was easier than asking what a woman who'd already lost everything might actually be fighting for. Even if it's true. Cyrus's voice was careful. Even if every word of it's true, Ezra Della's still in that mine. Silas Crane's still holding the clock. The truth doesn't buy her 1 extra hour. No. Ezra stood slow, the shoe still in his palm. But it changes what I'm willing to do to get her back. It has to. I didn't survive that canyon in '76 by telling myself the lie that following orders makes a man innocent of what the orders cost. I'm about to make that same mistake twice in one lifetime, Cyrus. Not even for Della. Especially not for Della. She'd never forgive me the second version of that mistake, and honestly, neither would I. That was the same day he found the bracelet. Small, woven from horsehair and thread gone faded with years, tucked into the wagon's floor gap alongside the shoe. The kind of small handmade thing a person keeps, not because it's worth anything, but because it's worth everything to exactly one person. Ezra turned it over in his fingers, and something about the pattern, the particular twist of the weave, snagged at a memory he couldn't place. Until he could. Della had one like it. Kept it in the bottom of her sewing chest, wrapped in cloth, a thing she'd shown him exactly once in 3 years of marriage, and never explained beyond a single sentence, offered quiet. Closing a door before he'd even known there was one to close. Some kindnesses you don't get to talk about. You just get to have done them. He remembered the evening she'd said it. A cold night, early in their marriage, when he'd found the cloth bundle by accident, reaching for a spool of thread, and asked what it was without thinking. There might be a story behind it worth guarding. She'd gone very still, taken it from him gentle, but firm, and wrapped it back up, and said the one sentence. And that had been the end of the conversation, not because he'd pushed and lost, but because he'd seen, in the set of her jaw, exactly how much it would cost her to say more, and decided a long time ago that loving Della Doyle meant not asking her to pay costs he had no right to demand. He'd let it go back then, hadn't pushed. Some doors, he'd learned a long time ago, you don't force open on someone you love, because love means trusting they'll open it themselves when they're ready. Standing now over a burned slave wagon with a stranger's bracelet in his palm, he wondered, for the first time, exactly what his wife had never told him. Wondered how many years back her own quiet kindness reached, and toward who, and whether the woman leaving arrows and mercy in these mountains, and the woman who'd once kept a faded horsehair bracelet wrapped in connected by something neither of them had ever had a chance to say out loud to each other. Because what if the debt he was carrying wasn't only his own? What if Della's silence all these years hadn't been about protecting some small private grief, but about protecting people, real people, with names he'd never been told, faces he'd never been shown, who'd needed her silence a great deal more than his curiosity had ever needed satisfying? He didn't know yet. He only knew the question wasn't going away, and that some part of the answer, he suspected, was going to matter a great deal more than he currently understood. He tucked the bracelet into his shirt pocket, next to the photograph, 2 small folded truths riding against his chest, and told himself he'd ask her, properly, honestly, the moment he had her home safe enough to ask anything at all. They weren't alone on the trail. He'd known it since the 3rd day and hadn't said so, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. A 5th set of tracks, careful, professional, staying always a half day behind and never quite closing the distance, the mark of a man who wanted to watch, not to catch up. Ezra recognized the pattern because it was his own pattern, the one he'd have used himself once, back when watching was the job. He'd spotted the first hint of it 2 days back, a boot print, wrong shape for Cyrus, wrong shape for either of their own horses, pressed into ground half a mile off the trail, where nobody with honest business would have any reason to walk. He'd said nothing then. Told himself, the way a man tells himself things he isn't ready to carry yet, that it might be nothing. A drifter. A prospector. Coincidence. Wearing a stranger's boots. By the 5th day, coincidence had stopped being a story he could keep believing. Crane sent somebody after us. He told Cyrus that evening, low, though there was no one close enough to overhear. Who? I don't know his name, I know his stride. Longer than yours, shorter than mine, favors his left boot, slightly old injury, maybe. Professional. Patient. Ezra spat into the fire. Crane doesn't trust either one of us to finish this clean, so he sent a man to make sure it gets finished his way regardless of what we decide. Cyrus went very still. There's a man Crane keeps on retainer, he said slowly. Name of Garrett Voss. Never met him myself, only heard the mill hands talk. Says he doesn't take a job unless it's the kind other men have already failed at, and he doesn't leave a job half finished no matter what he finds when he gets there. That's comforting. I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm trying to tell you what kind of man's half a day behind us, so you go into whatever's coming with your eyes open instead of your guard down. If he catches up, then we've got a different problem than the one we rode out here with. Ezra's jaw tightened. A problem with a rifle and Crane's silver behind it, and no debt of friendship, to slow it down before it pulls the trigger. Voss doesn't care whether she's guilty or grieving, Cyrus. He doesn't care whether Della lives or dies. Past the point where his payment clears. He's just going to finish the job, the fastest way available to him, and if that means putting a bullet in both of us along with her, I doubt it'll cost him a single night's sleep. Cyrus was quiet a long moment. Then we'd best find her before he does, he said finally, because whatever you're planning to say to that woman, Ezra, whatever mercy you're hoping to find room for a paid gun, won't wait around for the conversation. Ezra nodded slowly and looked back out over the dark ridgeline where, somewhere, a patient man was closing the distance one careful mile at a time, entirely indifferent to deaths, or grief, or the shape of mercy Ezra had begun. Against every instinct 3 years of quiet had trained into him, to hope might still be possible. The 6th day nearly killed him. He was working a narrow shelf trail along a canyon wall, close enough to a fresh set of tracks that his whole body had gone tight with the nearness of it, when the mountains simply let go above him. No warning. No sound worth the name until the sound was already on top of him, rock and gravel, and half a hillside coming down at once, and Ezra threw himself sideways with no plan at all beyond not there, not where it's falling, and the world turned into noise and dust, and a blow to his side that folded him half in two before he understood he was even hurt. He came to face down in mud. Rain where had rain come from, he hadn't even registered the storm arriving, in hammering cold against the back of his neck, one arm bent under him wrong. Ribs screaming with every breath. He couldn't move. Genuinely couldn't, for long enough that a colder fear than the pain itself began working through him, the fear of a man who understands, all at once, that dying alone in a canyon 1,000 miles from his wife is a very real and very present possibility, not a thing that happens to other men in other stories. He thought of Della. Of course he thought of Della. He thought of her laugh, low in her chest, and the way she'd argued with a mule the first day he ever saw her, and he thought, with a clarity that frightened him more than the pain did, that he might genuinely die here, in the mud, having failed her in the one single task he'd been given 7 days to complete. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. You don't get to die in a ditch. Ezra Doyle. Not while she's still sitting in that mine believing you're coming back for her. He didn't know how long he lay there. Long enough for the rain to soak through everything. Long enough for the cold to stop being a sensation and start being a kind of company. Until a shadow moved between him and the gray sky. He couldn't lift his head far enough to see clearly. Only shapes. A figure crouched close, and hands, careful hands. Sure, hands that had clearly done this kind of work before checking the wound at his side with a touch too precise to be anything but practiced. He managed barely a word. Mostly. Breath. She didn't answer, didn't need to. He felt something pressed into his hand, a water skin, cool against fingers gone numb, and something else laid gentle against the wound at his ribs. Cloth, tight enough to matter, gone again before he could properly register the act of it happening. She worked fast. Efficient. A person who'd bound wounds before, more times than any single life should reasonably require, and asked no permission and offered no comfort beyond the plain competence of the work itself. Why, he asked, when she'd finished, voice still barely more than breath. Why not just leave me here? She didn't answer that either. Not yet. By the time he found the strength to turn his head, she was already 10 feet up the slope, moving away through the rain like she'd never been there at all. Why? He called after her. Louder now, forcing the word out past ribs that screamed at the effort. Why, help me. I came here to. She stopped. Didn't turn around. For a long moment the only sound was rain hammering rock, hammering the wrecked slope between them. I know why you came, she said. Her voice, when it finally came, was low and steady and carried across the wet air with a clarity that cut straight through the storm. I have known since the 2nd day. A man who wanted me dead quick would not have fed his fire so bright it could be seen from the ridge. Then why the pit? Why the wagon that nearly killed my horse? Because I needed to know what kind of man Crane sent. She still hadn't turned. There have been 5 before you. All of them wanted the silver on my head more than they wanted the truth of why it was placed there. You are the first who stopped at the wagon and looked like a man discovering something he did not expect to find. There's a 6th man behind us, Ezra said, forcing the words out. No. Crane's man. Voss. He won't stop to look at anything. For the first time, something in her posture shifted, not fear exactly, but a recalculation, the stillness of a person adjusting a plan that had just gotten more complicated. Then we do not have as much time as I had hoped to decide what you are, she said. Rest, she added. before he could ask what that meant. "You are no use to your wife dead in a canyon, and I am not finished deciding what use, if any, you are going to be to me." Then she was gone, truly this time swallowed into rock and rain, and 6 years of practice at not being found by anyone who hadn't earned the finding. Ezra lay in the mud a long while after, the water skin still clutched in one hand, and let himself, just for a moment, believe that something in this whole impossible errand might yet be salvageable. Not simple. Nothing about this had been simple since the moment Crane's riders came up the ridge road. But salvageable, that was a word he could hold on to, cold and wet and half broken, in a canyon that didn't care one way or the other whether he lived to see the end of his 7 days. It took him one more day to track her to the place she finally let herself be tracked, to a narrow hidden canyon on the western face of the range, the kind of ground a person chooses when they've stopped running from something and started defending it. The last stretch was the hardest of the whole trail. His ribs had stiffened into something that made every breath its own small negotiation. Cyrus wanted to make camp, rest another day, argued that a half-broken man walking into a defended canyon was a man walking into his own funeral. Ezra didn't disagree with the logic. He simply didn't have a day to spend on it. "Voss is close," he said, which was the only argument that mattered anymore. "I can feel him closer than I could yesterday. If I don't reach her first, none of this, the wagon, the mercy in the rain, any of it is going to matter to anybody." He went in on foot, ribs still wrapped tight, Cyrus left behind at the canyon mouth, with strict instructions not to follow no matter what he heard. The canyon narrowed as it climbed, walls pressing close, the kind of ground that swallowed sound and threw it back, distorted, so that his own footsteps seemed to come from 3 directions at once. He moved slow, careful, every tracker's instinct in him, screaming that he was walking into a killing ground built by someone who knew exactly how to use one. He didn't get 20 yards past the narrowest point before the world tilted sideways, and a blade was suddenly, impossibly, resting cold against the line of his throat. He hadn't heard her, hadn't felt so much as a shift in the air. One moment he was alone in the canyon, and the next her weight was solid against his back, one arm locked across his chest, the blade so close against his skin, he could feel his own pulse beating up against the edge of it. "Careful," she said, close behind his shoulder, voice a low current in his ear. The last man who walked this canyon uninvited did not walk back out of it. "I'm not him. No, the knife didn't move. You are worse. You are the one who almost made me believe you might be different, and then came looking anyway. I came because I had no choice left that didn't end with my wife dead, and because there's a man half a day behind me who won't stop to ask a single question before he puts a bullet in both of us. There is always a choice, Ezra Doyle." His name, in her mouth, landed like something physical, a weight he hadn't expected to feel. "You have simply not yet decided which one costs you less to live with." The blade stayed where it was, steady, patient. Ezra's heart hammered against ribs already screaming from the fall 2 days back, and somewhere behind him, he understood with a clarity that arrived far too late to do him any good, that every choice he'd made since the moment Crane's riders came up, that ridge road had been leading, one narrow trail at a time, directly to this blade, this canyon, this woman who had every right in the world to end the conversation before it properly began. "I found the second wagon," he said, forcing the words out slow, steady, because panic here would cost him whatever thin thread of curiosity he'd earned across 5 days of watching and being watched. "The chains, the shoe. I know now what you're fighting for, and it isn't what Crane told me." The blade didn't move, but something in her breathing, close against his ear, changed the smallest fraction, barely perceptible, the sound of a person recalculating everything they thought they understood about the man in front of them. Far below, faint enough that Ezra almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, a single rifle shot cracked across the canyon and rolled away into echo. Both of them went still. "That's not Cyrus," Ezra said low. "Cyrus doesn't fire warning shots. Cyrus fires when there's something worth hitting. Voss." Her voice had changed to not fear, still not fear, but a sharpened, focused calculation, the sound of a person doing rapid arithmetic with very little time left to finish it. "He has found the canyon mouth faster than I judged him capable of." "Then we don't have time for you to finish deciding whether to trust me." "No," she agreed, "we do not." The blade stayed at his throat one more second. 2. Long enough that Ezra genuinely did not know, standing rain-soaked and injured in a canyon with a killer closing from below, which way this particular knife edge of a moment was going to fall. "Ask me what you came to ask, and ask it honest." "I will know if you don't." Ezra closed his eyes. Rain-soaked, ribs broken, a blade at his throat, 7 days narrowed down now to their final hours, and somewhere below them in the dark a paid killer closing the last of the distance between them. He had one chance to say this right. "My wife is dying in a mine because of me," he said. "Because of what I used to be, and what a man named Crane thinks I still am. I don't want to kill you. I never did, not really, not once I understood what I was actually being sent to do, but I need." The blade pressed a fraction closer. "You need," she said, "a way to save the woman you love without becoming the thing she asked you not to become." Ezra's breath caught. "How did you?" "'Cause it is the only kind of man Crane has never once sent me," she said, quiet now, almost, though he could hardly believe it, almost gentle. "And I have been waiting 6 years to find out if such a man still exists in this territory, or if I have simply been telling myself a story to make the killing easier to carry." Below them, closer now, a second shot rang out. And this time Ezra heard, underneath it, the unmistakable sound of a man shouting Cyrus's name into the dark like a challenge. The knife stayed at his throat. Neither of them moved. And somewhere in that narrow canyon, with rain still dripping cold off the rocks, and a paid killer's boots already climbing the trail behind them, Ezra Doyle waited to learn which answer he'd just become, and whether either of them was going to live long enough to find out what it actually meant. The knife came away from his throat so fast Ezra almost didn't register it happening. 1 second, cold steel. The next nothing, and Ayanna was already moving past him toward the canyon mouth, quick and low, rifle off her back, before he'd fully turned around. "Voss," he said. "Not a question. Your friend is still shooting back, which means he is still alive. Which means we do not yet have the luxury of finishing our conversation." She didn't look at him. "Can you run? Watch me." He couldn't, not really, not with ribs held together mostly by stubbornness and a wrap of cloth 2 days old. He ran anyway. Some things a man does because the alternative, standing still while someone he's responsible for takes a bullet meant for him, simply isn't available as an option. Every stride sent a fresh bolt of white through his side. He didn't slow. Couldn't afford to. Cyrus's life had just become a clock running faster than the one Crane had ever given him, and clocks like that didn't wait politely for a man to catch his breath. They came around the canyon bend into chaos. Cyrus was pinned behind a boulder, rifle smoking, face gone white with something that wasn't quite panic but was standing close enough to it to shake hands. Above him, on a shelf of rock maybe 40 feet up, a man Ezra had never seen before knelt with a rifle sighted down, patient, unhurried, the posture of somebody who did this for a living and had never once let a job rattle him. Garrett Voss didn't look like much, that was. Ezra understood instantly exactly the point. Plain hat, plain coat, a face a man could pass 3 times in a saloon and never once remember. The kind of unremarkable that made a killer effective for years before anybody thought to write his description down. "Doyle." Voss's voice carried clean across the canyon, almost friendly. "Didn't expect you'd still be breathing. Disappointing you seems to be my new specialty. Crane sent me to make sure this got finished." Voss didn't lower the rifle. "I was hoping you'd have finished it yourself by now and saved us both the trouble. Since you haven't." The shot came before he finished the sentence. Ezra threw himself sideways on instinct, dragging Cyrus with him, and the bullet took a chip out of the rock where his head had been a half-second before. Above them, Ayanna was already moving, using the chaos, closing the distance along a route no sane man would have attempted at a dead run, and Voss's second shot went wide, chasing a target that had already stopped being where the shot expected it. "She's fast," Cyrus said, breathless, pressed flat against the boulder. "She's had 6 years of practice being fast at exactly this." Ezra risked a glance around the boulder's edge. Voss was recalculating. Ezra could see it. In the small shift of his shoulders, the flat economy of a professional realizing that terrain had turned against him faster than his information had promised. Good men in this line of work didn't gamble on bad odds. They folded and lived to collect a different payment another day. He was right. It ended in the way these things sometimes do, not with a killing blow but with a retreat. Voss was good. Ezra would give him that much. Turning it over later, good enough to read, inside of 30 seconds, that the arithmetic of this particular fight had shifted against him. 1 armed woman who knew the canyon better than her own hands. 2 armed men who weren't going to stop coming. He fired twice more. Cover shot, buying himself distance, and was gone over the ridge before either Ezra or Cyrus could close on him. "He'll be back," Ayanna said, dropping down beside them, breathing hard for the first time since Ezra had met her. Men like that do not walk away from a payment half collected. How long? A day. Perhaps less if Crane grows impatient. She looked at Ezra, something in her expression settled now, decided in a way it hadn't been in the canyon. Which means we do not have time left for you to earn my trust slowly. So I am going to give it to you quickly instead, and hope I am not making the same mistake twice in one lifetime. She took them to a hollow in the rock, hidden behind a fall of boulders that looked, from 10 feet away, like solid stone and nothing else. Inside a small fire pit, blankets, and something Ezra hadn't expected at all, a stack of papers, careful dry wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. Dozens of them. What is this? He asked. Proof. She unwrapped the bundle with hands that had clearly done this before, gentle, practiced, the reverence of someone handling something that had cost a great deal to gather. Names, dates, testimony from those who survived the wagons long enough to speak of it, where they were taken from, how long they were held, which of Crane's men did the taking. I have been collecting it for 2 years. 2 years, Ezra's voice had gone quiet. This whole time you weren't just killing? Something almost like amusement crossed her face, thin and brief. I understand why the stories say that. It is a simpler thing to say than the truth. Burning a wagon is one afternoon's work. Building a case a federal marshal cannot ignore that is years. I have done both, because both were necessary, and because grief alone does not free anyone chained to a floorboard. Only proof does that. Proof, and someone with enough power to act on it once they have it. Ezra crouched and looked closer at the pages, careful not to touch. The way you look at something you understand instinctively is worth more to currently have the right to handle. Names written in careful hand, hers, he realized, taught to herself somewhere along the way, letter by patient letter, because a case built on nothing but memory dies with the person carrying it. Dates. A rough map of the supply routes Crane used, marked with small symbols he didn't yet understand but suspected marked something worse than silver. He understood, with a clarity that landed somewhere between shame and something close to awe, that he'd spent 5 days hunting a woman he'd believed to be a killer, when she'd actually been the only person for 100 miles doing the patient, unglamorous work of trying to end the killing altogether. 6 years of grief, and instead of letting it burn her down to nothing, she'd turned it, slow and deliberate, into the one weapon Crane's kind of men couldn't simply outshoot. I always meant to find a marshal willing to listen, she said. But a lone woman riding into a federal office with these papers, do you understand how that ends, Ezra Doyle? I would be arrested before the first page was read. Perhaps worse. I needed someone the territory would believe. A white man, a soldier, once. Someone with a name that opens doors mine cannot. She looked at him steady. I did not expect Crane to send that man to me himself. That's not luck, Ezra said slowly. That's the kind of thing that only looks like luck after it's already happened. Perhaps. The ghost of something unreadable crossed her face. Or perhaps I have simply learned these 6 years to be patient, enough that eventually the right door walks itself up to my hand. Either way, you are here now. That is the only part of it that matters. There's something else. Cyrus said once the papers were wrapped away again. Something I should have said back at the canyon mouth, except Voss's rifle rather interrupted the conversation. Say it now. Before he ran, he shouted something. Might not have meant for me to hear it clear. Might not have meant anything by it at all, except it's been sitting wrong in my gut since. Cyrus's jaw tightened. He said Crane's orders don't end with the woman dead. Said, and I'm quoting close as I can manage, the wife doesn't walk out of that mine either way. Boss doesn't leave loose ends breathing. The words landed in Ezra's chest like a physical blow. He was never going to let her go. I don't know that for certain. You don't have to know it for certain, Cyrus. You just have to look at the man. Crane doesn't leave witnesses to a trafficking operation walking around telling stories at church socials. Della's seen his face. Heard him give orders. Of course he was never going to. He stopped. Because finishing the sentence meant admitting, out loud, in front of 2 people who could do nothing to fix it, that the entire 7-day bargain had been a lie from the moment Crane offered it. That every mile of this trail, every near death, every hard-won piece of trust with a woman he'd been sent to kill, all of it had been built on top of a promise that was never real to begin with, which meant there was no version of this where he brought back proof of anything, and Della simply walked free, which meant the only path left ran straight through the mine itself, and there was no more time to walk it slow. Something cold settled into him then, replacing the fear with a kind of terrible clarity he recognized from a long time ago. You, in a uniform, Before he'd learned what that clarity could cost, a man who let it run unchecked, he pushed it back down. Not this time. This time the clarity was going to serve rescue, not ruin, and he intended to make very sure of the difference before the day was through. How far, he said, the Ironwood claim. From here. Hard riding, Ayanna said. We reach it by tomorrow's first light. Then we ride tonight, Ezra. Cyrus's voice careful. You can barely sit a saddle. Ribs like yours will heal, Cyrus, same as everything else has healed on this trip so far. Della won't. If we wait a day, we don't have. So we ride tonight, and we ride hard, and if my ribs have an objection, they can raise it with somebody who has time to listen. They rode through the night. Ezra's ribs screamed with every jolt of the saddle, and he let them scream, because pain was at least a thing he understood, a thing with edges he could measure, unlike the fear sitting under it, colder, wider, entirely without edges at all. She's already dead. Some ugly, frightened part of him kept whispering, somewhere past midnight, when the exhaustion had worn his defenses down to nothing. You're riding hard toward a woman who's already gone, and you're going to arrive just in time to confirm it. He shoved the thought down. Then it came back. Then he shoved it down again, and it came back a third time wearing a different face. What if you're too late? What if the last thing she remembers of you is a promise you couldn't keep? What if 7 days was never really 7 days at all? Just a number Crane picked, because it sounded generous, and somewhere in that grinding cycle he understood that this exact fear, ridden through in the dark, unanswerable, might be the truest cost of the whole 7 days. Not the ribs, not the pit or the landslide or the blade at his throat. This. He thought about the porch 2 months back, her hand in his, the dark coming on soft and easy. I'm not going anywhere, he'd told her. Meant it with his whole chest. And now here he was, riding through a black and indifferent night, discovering exactly how much a man could mean a promise, and still not fully control whether the world let him keep it. Ayanna rode close beside him for a stretch near dawn and seemed to read something in his silence. You are thinking the worst, she said. I'm a tracker. Thinking the worst is half the job. Then think this also. Her voice was steady, low, carrying easy over the sound of hooves on rock. Crane is a careful man. Careful men do not waste a hostage before they are certain the leverage has stopped being useful. As long as he believes there is any chance you might still bring him what he asked for, your wife breathes. It is only once he believes that chance is gone that the danger becomes immediate. That's not much comfort. It was not meant as comfort. It was meant as fact, because fact is more useful to you right now than comfort would be. She glanced at him, something almost gentle in it despite the flat delivery. We are going to arrive before he reaches that certainty. That is the plan. Ride, Ezra Doyle. Grief later. Ride now, he rode. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent, patient, the same stars that had watched this whole territory bury its griefs and build its fortunes for longer than any man riding beneath them tonight would ever fully understand. Somewhere ahead, past the last black ridge, Della was either alive or she wasn't, and there was nothing left to do about that particular uncertainty, except close the distance as fast as 4 legs and sheer stubbornness could manage. What Ezra didn't know yet, riding hard through that last black stretch of night, was that his wife had spent the previous evening doing exactly what she'd spent every evening of her captivity doing, working. She'd counted the guard rotations until she knew them better than she knew her own pulse. She'd worked a loose nail free from the storeroom's timber frame, patient, 1 small twist a day so as not to draw notice, and kept it hidden in the hem of her sleeve against the day it might prove useful. She'd listened, through the storeroom wall, to every conversation Crane's men had within earshot, and pieced together slow, the shape of an operation far larger and uglier than silver alone could explain. She hadn't known Ezra was coming that particular morning. Couldn't have known, not with any certainty, deep into a 7-day clock that could have run out 100 different ways. But she'd decided, somewhere around the 3rd night, lying awake on that cot, with the mountains cold coming up through the stone, that she was not going to be a woman who simply waited to be rescued. She was going to be ready when the chance came to help finish the job herself. So when the western slope tore open in a roar that shook dust loose from the storeroom ceiling, and Crane came storming in moments later, pistol drawn, shouting orders to guards who were no longer listening, Della Doyle was already standing, already watching the door, already quietly, working the loose nail free from her sleeve, just in case her hands needed to be useful for something sharper than argument. They reached the Ironwood claim as the sky went gray at the edges, The mine's black mouth cut into the hillside like a wound that had never properly closed. 2 guards at the entrance. Ezra counted them out of old habit before he'd finished deciding what to do about them, and Ayanna was already moving, already reading the same ground he was, and for one strange suspended second, the two of them worked in a silence so complete it felt, absurdly, like they'd rehearsed this 100 times instead of once, in a canyon, with a knife between them less than a full day ago. West side, she murmured. The rock face there is weak. I have used it before. Used it for what? For becoming a diversion. The ghost of something almost like a smile. It is, I find, one of my particular talents. How long do I have? As long as it takes them to stop believing the mountain itself has decided to attack them, which in my experience is usually longer than sense would suggest. She checked the rifle across her back, a small habitual motion the kind a person makes without noticing they're making it. Find your wife, Ezra Doyle. I will make certain nobody is watching the door while you do. Ayanna. He caught her arm just for a second before she moved off. Whatever happens after this, thank you. For the water in the rain. For not killing me when you had every right to. For all of it. Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that it changed the shape of her expression entirely, if only for a heartbeat. Thank me after your wife is standing beside you, she said. Gratitude spoken too early has a way of tempting fate to prove it premature. The explosion, if it could even be called that, more a controlled collapse of loose shale, she'd clearly identified on some earlier path through the westerns in slope with a roar that brought both guards running, shouting, rifles up, entirely convinced the mine itself was under attack from that direction. Ezra went in the other way fast, ribs be damned. He found Cyrus already inside, having circled wide during the confusion, and together they moved through tunnels lit by nothing but a single lamp. Cyrus had lifted off an unconscious guard, following the architecture of a place built to hold silver, and Ezra understood now, with a fury that burned clean through the fear built also, apparently, to hold people. Side passages branched off the main shaft, some barred, some not, and Ezra forced himself not to look too closely into any of them as he passed, because looking meant stopping, and stopping meant time he didn't have. He found the storeroom door, by the sound coming from behind it. A voice low steady, arguing with somebody in a tone that carried straight through solid timber. Della's voice. And I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Crane, that whatever you think you're accomplishing here, you are not the kind of man history remembers kindly, and I intend to make certain, if I live through this week, that a great many people learn exactly what kind of man you actually are. Ezra had never in his life been so relieved to hear his wife being difficult. Something in his chest, held tight and clenched for 6 long days, came loose all at once, so fast it nearly dropped him where he stood. He put a hand flat against the door just to feel the solid fact of it, the last barrier between himself and the only thing he'd ridden this whole broken week to reach. Then he stepped back and put his shoulder into it. The door gave under his shoulder on the second try. Crane was inside, standing near the cot, a pistol loose in one hand, and Della bound at the wrist still, jaw set, eyes blazing with a fury that hadn't dimmed 1 single degree across the whole ordeal, was standing, not sitting, chin up, refusing him even the small victory of her fear. Ezra. Her voice cracked on his name just once, before the iron came back into it. You're late. I had some detours. Crane's pistol swung toward the door, toward Ezra, and for one endless second the whole room held its breath. You didn't bring me a body, Crane said. No. Ezra didn't move, didn't reach for anything. I brought you the truth instead, which I imagine you're going to like a great deal less. The Crane's laugh had no humor in it at all. I don't need the truth, Doyle. I need proof my brother's death was avenged. Seen Nibsips in the lurved, that purpose. Fine whether it was the right corpse or not, since you've apparently decided sentiment matters more than your own wife's life. Don't! Ezra's voice had gone flat. Dangerous. Don't you dare stand there and pretend this was ever about your brother, Crane. I've seen the wagons, I've seen the chains. Daniel's death gave you a story you could tell yourself, and yourself alone, to make the rest of it feel like something other than what it actually was. And what was it, in your expert opinion?
Greed.
Ezra took one slow step into the room. Plain, ordinary greed, wearing grief like a coat, because grief's easier to live with than admitting what you actually built out here. Crane's face had gone tight, the mask slipping for just a moment to show something uglier underneath. You should have brought me a body, he said again, quieter now, and raised the pistol properly this time, aimed steady. It was Della who moved first. Days of rope had left her wrists raw but not weak, and she'd clearly spent every one of them doing exactly what Della Doyle did best: watching, waiting, cataloging the creak of a floorboard, the exact half-second of distraction a man's own threat bought him. She drove her bound hands up and into Crane's gun arm, the instant his attention split between the door and the woman he'd stopped fully watching, and the pistol went off wild, the shot burying itself harmlessly in timber. And then Ezra was across the room, and the fight, such as it was, didn't last very long at all. Crane was not, it turned out, a man who did his own violence well when the theater was stripped away from it. He went down hard against the storeroom's iron wall, pistol clattering free, and Ezra had him pinned there, forearm across his throat, close enough to feel the man's whole body shaking with the fear he'd spent this entire ordeal making other people feel instead. "I could end this right here," Ezra said low. "You know I could." "Then do it." "No." Ezra stepped back, breathing hard, letting Crane slide down the wall into a heap that had nothing left of the man who'd sat a black gelding in Ezra's yard a week ago, unhurried, certain of every card he held. "I already decided, a long time before I ever reached this room, exactly what kind of man I was willing to become to get her back. And it isn't you, Crane. It was never going to be you." Outside, in the gray light past the mine mouth, it was already ending in a different way entirely. Word had traveled through Crane's own men faster than gunfire. Ayanna's diversion had drawn the guards, and Cyrus, moving fast in the chaos, had shouted the truth of the trafficking papers to anyone close enough to hear, and something in that truth had done what no amount of loyalty or fear ever quite managed. It cracked the men Crane had built his operation on wide open. They weren't murderers, most of them. Ezra understood that later, turning the whole day over the way he turned over everything. They were men who'd taken silver mine wages and told themselves the wagons weren't their business, that whatever happened past the loading dock belonged to somebody else's conscience, not theirs. And there is a particular kind of betrayal a man cannot forgive once he understands the shape of what he's actually been part of, the sudden, sick recognition that his own silence had been doing work all along, work he'd never once agreed to out loud. Crane, stumbling out of that storeroom with a split lip and Della's fury still ringing in his ears, found precious few hands willing to raise a weapon in his defense. One of the older foremen, a gray-bearded man named Thatcher, who'd worked the ironwood claim since before Crane ever bought it, simply set his rifle down in the dirt and walked away without a word, and that single small act seemed to give every other man standing there permission to do the same. Voss was among them, arriving too late and choosing, with the flat professional pragmatism of a man who never once let sentiment interfere with a payment, to simply ride away rather than stand for a fight the arithmetic no longer favored. Crane did not get to ride away. What happened to him after that, Ezra chose not to watch too closely. Some justice, he'd learned a long time ago, in a canyon he still occasionally dreamed about, was better left to be delivered by hands other than his own. Cyrus found him a moment later, in the chaos still settling around the mine mouth, and neither man said anything at first. Just stood there, breathing hard, alive, in a way that felt too large for words to properly hold. "We did it," Cyrus said finally, like he hadn't quite believed it would be true until he heard himself say it out loud. "We did." Ezra put a hand on his shoulder, steadying them both. 6 years, Cyrus. 6 years I carried that wall at Rimrock Pass like it was the only thing that ever mattered between us, and you carried the guilt of my yard like it was the only thing that mattered from your side. I think we're square now. More than square. I don't know that a man ever gets to be fully square on a debt like that. Maybe not." Ezra looked at him steady. "But I'd rather spend the rest of my life owing you nothing and being grateful anyway than keep score forever like the ledger's the only thing that matters. You pulled your weight out here, Cyrus. More than pulled it. Go home to Faye. Tell her the truth finally caught up to you, and it turned out to be lighter to carry than the lie ever was." Cyrus's eyes had gone wet, though he'd have denied it if asked. "You're getting soft in your old age, Doyle. Della's been saying that for years. I'm starting to think she might be right." Ayanna found them an hour later, in the gray light outside the mine, Della finally free of the rope and pressed hard against Ezra's chest, like she meant to fuse the two of them back into a single piece. He held her a long moment before either of them said anything at all, felt the shape of her, real and warm and breathing, against him, and let himself finally believe it. A week of fear didn't unwind in a single embrace, but it started there. It had to start somewhere, and there, in the gray morning light, with the mine still smoking behind them, was as good a place as any he could have chosen. Della looked up first. looked at the woman standing a few feet off, rifle slung easy across her back, and something crossed her face that Ezra had never seen on it before, not fear, not suspicion, but a kind of recognition, slow and total, the particular look of someone finding a shape they'd been carrying blind in the dark and finally seeing it in daylight. "You're her," Della said. "The ghost." "I am called that." "Yes." Della's hand went, without her seeming to fully decide it, to the small pocket where she kept, folded and worn soft with years, a scrap of cloth that had never once left her sewing chest until this morning, when she'd apparently thought to bring it, not knowing why, not knowing this was where the week would end. She held it out. A bracelet. Horsehair and thread, faded with years, the twin, Ezra realized with his whole chest going tight, of the one he still carried, folded in his shirt pocket from the wagon. Ayanna went very still. "Where did you get this?" she said. Barely a whisper. "A woman came through our land 8 years back, running, alone and terrified, and about to give birth to a grief so large it nearly broke her in half right there in my kitchen." Della's voice had gone soft, careful, the voice of someone finally setting down a weight she'd carried alone for a very long time. "She wouldn't tell me her name, said it was safer for both of us if she didn't. I fed her, hid her 3 days from men who came asking after runaways, soldiers, I believe, though she never said so outright, and I never pushed her to. And when she left, she gave me this, and told me I remember it exact, because I've turned it over in my head 1,000 times since she told me, someday someone will need to know a kindness like this still exists out here. Keep it, show them if that day ever comes." Ayanna's hand had come up to her own mouth, and for the first time in 6 years, by every account Ezra had ever heard whispered about her, something in her composure came apart entirely. "My sister," she said, voice breaking clean in half. "That was my sister. She fled after everything. I believed she died in the crossing. I have believed it 6 years. She didn't." Della's eyes were wet now too. "She made it to Sonora, far as I ever learned secondhand, years after. Wrote me exactly once, careful. No name, just to say she'd found safety. I never knew who to tell. Never knew there was anyone left who'd been waiting to hear it." Ezra watched the two of them, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stand there and witness it, a debt he hadn't even known existed. Incurred 8 years before he'd ever met either woman, finally, impossibly, coming due in the gray light outside a mind that had held them both, in different ways, prisoner. Della had carried her secret out of love for a stranger's safety. Ayanna had carried her grief out of love for a sister she believed the desert had taken. And here now, the two griefs turned out to have been two halves of a single unfinished story, waiting 6 years for exactly this morning to close the distance between them. The two women stood there a long moment, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with Ezra at all, and everything to do with the unbreakable thread that runs between women who have survived things men were never asked to survive in quite the same way. "Thank you," Ayanna said finally, voice still rough. "For a kindness I did not know had a name until this moment." "Thank her," Della said, nodding toward the mountains, toward wherever a sister she'd never met by name might still be living, safe, unaware her thread had just found its way home. "I only kept a promise. She's the one who trusted a stranger enough to leave it in my hands to keep." Ayanna didn't linger past that. She never had, in all the days Ezra had known her, and there was no reason for the habit to break now, with the mine still smoking behind them and men who'd soon come asking questions. She had no intention of staying to answer. "I should be gone before anyone thinks to ask my name," she said. "That has always been the safer way." "You could stay," Ezra said. "Testify yourself. The truth would carry more weight from you than from any of us. The truth will carry itself now. It no longer needs to be carried by a woman the territory has spent 6 years learning to fear instead of hear." She looked at him a long moment. "I did not spare you in that canyon because I decided you were owed forgiveness, Ezra Doyle. I spared you because I recognized, finally, a man willing to be changed by what he learned rather than simply surviving it. Do not waste it." "I don't intend to." "Good." She swung up onto her horse, then looked once more at Della. "Tell your sister, if the letters ever find their way to her again, that the debt she left in your kitchen 8 years ago came back around, in the end, to save my life as well as yours. Some kindnesses do that if you are patient enough to let them." "Where will you go?" Ezra asked. "North for a while. There is other proof to gather. Other wagons, other territories, other men who believe grief and greed look enough alike that nobody will trouble themselves to tell the difference." A faint tired smile. I do not think my work is finished, Ezra Doyle. I do not know that it ever fully will be. But it is lighter now, carrying it, knowing it does not have to stay only mine to carry. Then she was gone, the way she'd always been gone, without a sound, into country that had raised her and would, he suspected, and go on protecting whatever came next for her, same as it always had. They buried Silas Crane's silver mine operation in paperwork and testimony over the following weeks. Cyrus rode to the territorial marshal himself, papers in hand, desertion charges be damned. Because some debts, he told Ezra once it was done, matter more than the fear of paying a smaller one. Faye's going to be furious, he'd said, the morning he left for the marshal's office, trying for lightness and not quite managing it. Desertion still desertion, whatever the reason behind it. I might do time for it yet, you might. Worth it, though. Cyrus had looked at him then, steady, the way he hadn't quite managed to look at him since the day he rode into Ezra's yard beside Crane's men. I spent 6 years running from one bad choice, Ezra. Man can only run so long before the running becomes its own kind of sin. Figured it was time I stood still and let the consequences find me honest, instead of letting them keep chasing me through somebody else's yard. The marshal, as it turned out, cared a great deal more about a trafficking ring than about a 6-year-old desertion charge from a man who just helped break the case wide open. Cyrus rode home to Faye a free man, and Ezra never did hear the full story of what was said between them, only that she'd cried for the better part of an evening, and then, by all reports, made him the finest pot of coffee he'd had in years. Ayana's 2 years of patient evidence did exactly what she'd built it to do, carried the rest of the way by the papers Cyrus placed in the marshal's hands. The Ironwood claim closed. What men could be charged were. Ezra and Della rode home 3 days later, slow, careful of his ribs, careful of everything, in the slow, careful way two people move around each other after nearly losing what they'd built together. They didn't talk much on the ride. Didn't need to. Not yet. Some things a couple works out silence ins first, side by side, before either one of them trusts words to carry the weight properly. Every so often Della's hand would find his across the gap between their horses, brief, grounding. A small proof repeated over and over, that neither of them was a story the other one was going to have to finish alone. Scout met them at the gate, gray tail, going like it might come loose from the effort, and for a long moment neither Ezra nor Della could do anything but laugh a wet, shaking, overwhelmed kind of laugh, the kind that only shows up on the other side of something that came far too close to breaking you. The breadboard still sat where Della had left it, gone stiff and inedible weeks past, and she laughed again when she saw it, that low chest laugh, the one he'd fallen for on a dusty porch in Wilcox 3 years back, and threw it out for the birds, and started kneading a new batch before either of them had even unsaddled the horses. Some things, she said, flour already dusting her hands, a person's just got to start over. I know the feeling. She looked up at him then, something steady and searching in her eyes. Did you become it? The thing I asked you not to become? He thought about the question honestly before he answered it, the way he'd promised himself. Somewhere on that trail, he'd always try to answer her from now on. I got close, he said. Closer than I ever want to get again. But no, I don't think I did. I think in the end, I became something closer to who I was always supposed to be. If that canyon in '76 hadn't gotten there first and convinced me otherwise. Della crossed the kitchen and put both flour-dusted hands against his face, gentle, careful of the bruising still fading along his jaw. Good, she said simply. Because I did not marry a killer, Ezra Doyle. I married a man who knows the difference between surviving something and becoming it. Don't you ever make me wonder again which one I'm looking at. I won't. You'd best not. That evening, Ezra walked out past the barn alone, the rifle he'd carried the whole 7 days in his hand, and dug a hole beneath the old cottonwood at the edge of the property, and buried it there, deep, the way a man buries something he hopes never to need again. He stood a long while afterward, looking west, toward the Dragoon Mountains going purple, then gray, then gone in the last of the light. Somewhere out there, a woman who'd lost everything and rebuilt herself into something the whole territory once whispered about, in fear, was riding on. Unbothered, unbroken, carrying a truth now large enough that it no longer needed her alone to hold it up. Somewhere behind him, in a lamplit kitchen, his wife was humming something tuneless over a new batch of bread, and an old gray dog was already asleep across the threshold, dreaming, probably, of rabbits he'd never quite managed to catch. They had sent him to hunt her down to save the woman he loved. But in the end, it was she who had saved him from becoming, once and for all, the very thing his wife had begged him, on the worst morning of both their lives, never to become. He turned back toward the house, toward the lamplight in the window, toward Della's shadow moving warm and alive across the kitchen wall, and went home.